Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our conference, Deflating the Financial Carbon Bubble. My name is Reinhard Büdikofer. I'm one of the initiators, together with my colleague from the Netherlands, Bas Eickhout, one of the initiators of the study. And I'm very happy to see a lot of interest that you all expressed by joining us for this conversation this morning. Increasingly, experts are talking of an emerging carbon bubble in our financial system. The idea is that the value of fossil fuel firms is inflated because by limiting global warming, their fossil reserves would become unburnable and therefore worthless or partially worthless, which would devalue those companies. At the World Economic Forum, World Bank President Jim Yong Kim said that financial regulators need to lead as well. Sooner rather than later, they must address the systemic risk associated with carbon-intensive activities in their economies. Start now by enforcing disclosure of climate risk and requiring companies and financial institutions to assess their exposure to climate-related impacts, end of quote. And Achim Steiner from UNEP has called on accountants to, quote, track the carbon exposure of their investments and don't be misled by audited accounts which may be in the black when in reality your company or investment 5 to 10 years down the line may be sitting on stranded assets, end of quote. This school of thought is gathering pace and an increasing number of actors are divesting from fossil fuel companies. The Bank of England is looking into climate risks through a study that they're doing. The European Central Bank is not yet quite giving as much attention to the issue as their colleagues in London. In the public, it's becoming a topic. Yesterday, Handelsblatt reported about the study we're doing this morning. Good morning, Satu. This morning, the FT is reporting about a decision by the Norwegian government to set up an expert group to evaluate if their 840 billion oil fund should stop investing in fossil fuel companies. Now, that should sound an alarm to a lot of financial actors, I figure. We wanted to join this debate, and we have followed the European money behind this carbon bubble. We're happy to present to you the study that we had commissioned with the Sustainable Finance Lab and Profundo, which has investigated the high carbon investment of Europe's top 20 banks and top 23 pension funds, as well as the insurance company. And we're happy to have one representative from a pension fund from Finland joining us for the conversation later. We had also invited different banks. One of them said they would join us, Société Générale, but 1 week ago, after reading the study, they withdrew that confirmation. I don't know why. I think no one will be able to run away from the issue, though, and I'm happy that we can have a very informed conversation here today with, later on, with Jason Anderson, the head of EU Climate and Energy Policy from WWF EU, with Silja Varmola, the portfolio manager from Keva Pension Fund in Finland, with James Cameron, the founder and chairman of Climate Change Capital, with Didier Miraud, head of unit accounting and financial reporting in the DG Mart in the European Commission. And my colleague, Satu Hassi, will then be the moderator for that conversation later. But before I pass the floor to the authors of the study, Francis Weissig and Jan-Willem van Gelder, who are sharing the panel with us, we have two video messages. One is from Bevis Longstreth, the former commissioner of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission under President Reagan, and the other is from Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, who is organizing a campaign throughout, or is one of the forces behind a campaign that's gathering a lot of strength throughout the United States of carbon divestment. So please, let's have the two videos first.
I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak before such a distinguished and knowledgeable
Put up
group.
the volume.
Thank you, Reinhard Bütikofer, for inviting me. I only regret not being with you in person. So, as all you know, in 2010 at Cancun, governments agreed that to avoid planetary catastrophe, carbon emissions must be reduced to prevent a rise in global temperature of more than 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. Yet the IEA reports today that the current trend line for global warming takes the planet by mid-century to 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite growing alarms, carbon emissions increased by 1.5% per year from 1980 to 2000, and then that rate of increase doubled to 3% per year through 2012, and it continues to climb. At 7 degrees Fahrenheit, scientists predict our planet will be unrecognizable. Is our world insane? As Elizabeth Colbert wrote in Field Notes from a Catastrophe, quote, "It may seem impossible to imagine that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself, but that is what we are now in the process of doing," close quote. Thus far, governments have failed their people in addressing climate change. Although it's clear that the EU has done more than others, there are few promising signs. It's like picking up the garbage, a job that must be done, but everyone's waiting around for someone else to do it. What hope there is, as seen through my eyes, rests with the chance for a rising tide of private sector demand for change. The rapidly growing student movement for divestment points the way, but we have a long road to travel before emission growth turns negative, and the window of opportunity is closing fast. Of course, the demand for change will only succeed if energetic and unrelenting conviction at the grassroots level leads to conviction among those wielding power. I believe leaders who failed to take reasonable steps to stop carbon emissions from rising are morally equivalent to those seeking to deny the science and thereby brush away the problem, as long ago Galileo did in recanting to save his life, or very recently as Presidents Faust of Harvard and Paxson of Brown did in notably insensitive public statements rejecting student demands for divestment. Collectively, we are like the frog resting comfortably in a pot of cold water being heated to boiling. For example, consider the financial markets. Too few investors consider climate change an investment risk at all, while too many of those who do imagine it to be a tail risk of little importance. So the question is how to awaken the frog before it's too late. I've been rereading A Night to Remember, Walter Lord's definitive account of the Titanic's demise. The Titanic is a metaphor for the surpassing vanity of mankind and the indifferent brutality of nature. As such, it can speak powerfully to us about the looming threat of climate change. On that night in April 1912, hundreds of human beings consciously and with deliberation chose to die as a matter of honor in order to save women and children, particularly children. Men of privilege, such as Isidor Straus and Benjamin Guggenheim, refused places on the lifeboats, choosing to wait in deck chairs for death to come. The honor was to sacrifice in service to children and grandchildren, to generations yet unborn, and to the women who bear them. As applied to the climate debate, the question is, how do we think about our grandchildren when we continue to increase our use of cheap fossil fuel energy, knowing it's going to change their climate in catastrophic ways? The Titanic illustrates the uglier side of humanity as well. When the ship was gone and 1,000 voices screamed in agony in the sub-zero waters of the Atlantic, those in lifeboats lashed out at them with oars and then rowed away. Some nations may think they can row away from this planetary tragedy, the commons. But no, if that definition fits the case, as I think it does, this tragedy is one no nation can escape. Although the sinking of the Titanic is high drama, I don't believe it's any more fraught than the planetary threat we face today. It's just far more compressed. 2.5 hours to sink the boat instead of 35 or so years to reach 7 degrees. Somehow, despite this timeline, the resting frog, our collective self, must be awakened. So what do I have to suggest? Only time for a few random thoughts triggered by the important study produced for this conference. Is carbon a bubble? This is the assumption underlying today's conference. But carbon is only a bubble if fossil fuel reserves become unburnable because governments act to strand them, as the Carbon Tracker Initiative nicely put it. By the way, I confess to being a proud advisor to that terrific group. I hope there's a carbon bubble, but I worry that using this metaphor may lead people to assume it already exists, thus distracting them from concentrating on the very hard challenge of getting governments to act. Disclosure rules. At present, public corporations are not required to disclose many aspects of climate change that would be material to investors. For example, carbon content is a key financial element of fossil fuel reserves, but at present is not mandated by regulation. Recently, Jane Addams, the Carbon Tracker Initiative, and I petitioned the FASB to require just such disclosure, and also to require disclosure of sensitivity analyses on business prospects, using a variety of assumptions as to governmental restrictions on carbon emissions. But why not go further and mandate disclosure of corporate management's view of the basic science, and compel a corporation to disclose all financing of entities devoting themselves to climate denial? ExxonMobil's financing of the Heartland Institute enabled large billboards comparing those who accept the science to Charles Manson, the Unabomber, and Osama bin Laden. Forced transparency of such use of corporate assets would quickly dry up support for such nonsense. Conflicts of interest. I see undisclosed conflicts of interest as one of the most powerful factors in restraining those in positions of leadership and responsibility from doing the responsible thing. I speak of all those in power, whether they be in public or private life. To take one example from the world of education, the real underlying problem for universities like Harvard and Brown in considering divestment is the opaque and powerful interests of trustees, big giving alumni, administration, and faculty in not offending the fossil fuel industry. With full transparency, things would change for the better, sunlight being the best disinfectant. Here the leading role would fall to investigative journalists. I have some more ideas, but no more time to offer them. But my thanks again to Reinhardt for this chance to speak. I wish the conference success in generating goodly portions of both light and heat.
Hello, this is Bill McKibben from 350.org in the United States. I wish I was there with you in person because this is an important day. The release of this study on the high carbon assets held in the big banks of Europe and the pension funds and the insurance companies could be one of those pivotal moments in the fight against climate change. Let me back up a little bit and explain why I think it's so important. A couple of years ago, I wrote an article for, of all places, Rolling Stone magazine, that drew on the work of a fairly obscure UK group, Carbon Tracker Institute, that had first started looking into the question of how much carbon the big fossil fuel companies had in their reserves. The news was dismaying. If you look at the proved reserves, the stuff that the fossil fuel industry and the countries, think Kuwait, that operate like the fossil fuel industry, have told regulators they will burn, have told shareholders they will profit from, have told banks will serve as collateral. If you look at that, those reserves, they're about 5 times as large as any climate scientist thinks we can burn and get away with. That is to say, if those business plans are carried out, then the planet tanks. Once one had read those numbers, then the understanding began to dawn that these were not normal companies, that they were, in a sense, rogue companies, operating not against the laws of their nation or against the laws of the EU, but against the laws of physics, which in the end is a probably even more severe offense. You also began to understand that they were setting up the rest of us not only for ecological cataclysm, that part's already, sad to say, coming true, they were also potentially setting us up for one of the great bubbles, maybe the greatest bubble of all time. That the financial system, struggling to recover from the last bubble of 2008, now had to face the prospect of an even more dangerous and toxic situation where the leading industries, some of them in the whole world, could face sharp loss in value. That loss in value will come in many different ways, but in essence it will come, I think, if the countries of the world ever get serious about doing anything about climate change. If they do, and the way we'll know they're getting serious, of course, is when the price of carbon goes up, then the value of those holdings, those reserves, and the share value of those companies will go down, way down. And those stranded assets will be stranded, and the result will be not just ecological cataclysm, but grave financial difficulty as well. That's why it's so important to know and to see what this study indicates, that there is not an easy, cheap, perfect way out of it, but a way out of it. That a rapid transition away by our public institutions, by our banks and insurance companies from those assets provides the route out of this path with the least exposure. It's time to get to work on this, because the overall exposure of European financial institutions, probably a very conservative estimate, it's been calculated to be over €1 trillion. You guys have had to learn a little bit over the last few years how to deal in numbers that begin with T's. And it's not an easy job, and this is one headache that no one needs, especially since if we don't deal with it, if we don't manage to get out ahead of this problem, then the costs of adapting to climate change are, as Lord Stern and many others have pointed out, far, far, far greater even than that. So I hope that the occasion, the release of this study is an occasion for everybody to come as quickly as possible to the conclusion that we've got to change business as usual. Business as usual is not just a threat to the planet around us, but to the economy around us too. You know, the economy may not be as important as the planet in the long run. It's important as well. Many, many thanks to the smart people who figured out what these numbers look like. You know, they're now following in the steps not of Rolling Stone and Carbon Tracker, but in the last 2 years, it's the World Bank and the IEA and a number of other big multinational institutions like that that have given their imprimatur to this idea of divestment. This campaign has spread very quickly. Oxford put out a study in the fall saying it was the fastest growing such corporate campaign in history. In my country, over 300 colleges and universities have an ongoing active fight about this, and a number of already divested religious denominations, increasingly big pension funds. This is good news, but it has to happen quickly because the problem that we face is happening quickly. So, Godspeed to you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you very much for the work that you all do, day in and day out, for this planet that we share.
So that was our two contributors from across the Atlantic. And now I would turn it over to our two researchers who gave us the opportunity to have this conversation here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Francis Wijzig, and I am one of the authors of the study. We set out to assess the potential impact of the carbon bubble, which has just been described in these two video messages, on the EU financial system. Now, the financial world is a bit of a peculiar world. Pension and insurance companies, for example, they talk about longevity risk. Longevity risk is the risk that someone lives longer than expected. Now, that in fact is, well, provided it's a reasonably healthy long life, that is in fact a good thing, that someone lives longer than expected and doesn't die too soon. Of course, for pension funds and insurance companies paying out pensions or life insurance payments to those persons living a long life, there will be a cost involved. But in essence, longevity risk is the risk that something good happens. Now, what we've been looking at in this study is the carbon bubble risk. And carbon bubble risk is very much like longevity risk. In essence, it's the risk that something good happens. It is the risk that we will be able, and we will succeed in averting uncontrollable climate change. There will be a cost involved, but in the end, it's the risk that something good happens. I think the findings of our study, they are a wake-up call, or they should be, hence the clock. So let me provide you with the main conclusions of our study right away, and I'll provide some more details afterwards. We estimated the potential impact of a quick and definite transition to a low-carbon economy on the EU financial system. So we looked at pension funds, banks, and insurance companies. And we roughly estimated they could lose about 350 to 400 billion euros from such a transition. Now, that's a lot of money. If you are concerned about Greek government debt, for example, this amount is more than the losses on Greek government debt. So it's something substantial. It's something that the financial sector should really take account of. The good thing is that amount of losses, 350 to 400 billion euros, for the EU financial sector as a whole seems manageable. So financial stability risks do not seem to stand in the way of quickly and effectively addressing climate change and taking climate measures. However, if such a change does not come about quickly, but it is postponed and it takes longer, the cost will increase. So this clock doesn't just stand for a wake-up call, it also means the longer you wait, the higher the cost. And it's also the title of the study, The Price of Doing Too Little Too Late. If it's too late, or if it's too little, if it takes longer, the cost for the financial sector will increase. And if in the end, if climate measures or technological developments are insufficient to afford uncontrollable climate change, then of course the effects for the financial sector will be even larger. They will be most harmful because there will be large floods, extreme storms, droughts, and so on. Well, to some extent, we might experience effects like that today already. Think of droughts in the US, think of floods in the UK, and so on. So if there would be uncontrollable climate change, things like that would happen much more often, and that would, of course, have a devastating impact. So the wake-up call, I think, for policymakers is we'd better take those measures soon, because if we take them sooner, then the overall cost to the financial sector will be lower. Now, there is also a wake-up call for the financial sector, and that is slightly different, because if you look at the financial sector as a whole, it's probably well able to absorb a shock like this. However, there are large differences between financial institutions. For me personally, that was the largest eye-opener of this study, that there are so large differences between financial institutions. Some banks and some pension funds are much more exposed than others. One pension fund that seems to stand out, for example, is the UK University Superannuation Scheme. They have about twice the average exposure and about 5 to 10 times the exposure of some pension funds with low investments in oil, gas and mining companies. So for individual financial institutions there is a risk, and also for individual national sectors. So that's a third wake-up call. For policymakers, it's important to take measures soon. For financial institutions, it's important to make sure that they're not overexposed compared to others. The third one is for supervisors. It's not just individual financial institutions, also some countries, some national sectors are more exposed than others. In the UK, the University Superannuation Scheme doesn't stand alone. The entire UK pension sector is overexposed compared to other pension sectors. The same goes for the Dutch pension sector and the French banking sector. So these are the main conclusions. Now, let me explain to you how we arrived at these conclusions. I think the carbon bubble needs a little explanation, but I provide some background just to make sure that the numbers and the assumptions are clear. Now, assume that these are the proven fossil fuel reserves, coal, oil and also gas. Now, to limit global warming and avert uncontrollable climate change, there is a budget on the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. It's not an annual budget, because greenhouse gas emissions stay in the atmosphere for a very long period. So in fact, it's a budget for, say, the next 100 years. And if we would use that entire budget in the coming 20 or 25 years, which is the course that we are going right now, it means then for after that, either we will have uncontrollable climate change and large climate events, or we won't be able to use any of those reserves afterwards anymore. So the estimates, we didn't do these ourselves, but these have been on very other studies, are that of all the proven oil and gas and coal reserves, 60 to 80% cannot be used. So these cannot be used This is 60%. If you go for 80%, then these cannot be used either. And these estimates, they include progressive carbon capture and storage, and so they use very conservative assumptions in the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are going to result from the reserves that are being burned. Now, this is clearly going to affect financial markets and especially the valuation of extractive industries. So fossil fuel assets, the fossil fuel reserves held by extractive industries are overvalued, and the value of the firms, there's a bubble in it. Because financial markets are not calculating this in yet. You know, if financial markets see something coming, are sure that something going to happen, in theory, they should factor in that in the price of today. But this is not the case for stranded assets. Now, this has an effect on EU financial institutions. They will suffer losses from a shock like this. There will be direct effects. The price of commodities. If a large part of the existing fossil fuel reserves cannot be burned, cannot be used, those will not have a value. Also, fossil fuel firms, so oil, gas and coal mining firms, they will be more or less because they will generate less cash flows in the future. That also means they will have more difficulties to repay their long-term debt. So also the credit risk of those firms will increase. And that means the value of the bonds of these companies will be lower, and also the credit risk of the loans that they have outstanding with banks will be higher. These are direct effects. This is just the commodities themselves and the companies owning these commodity reserves. Now, there will be indirect effects too, because if oil, gas and coal cannot be used, that obviously has an effect on electricity producers. It has also an effect on energy-intensive industries. But the effect depends a bit on the driver of stranded assets. Because the driver need not necessarily be effective and determined climate policies. It could also be a technological breakthrough. So for those who don't think the European Union is capable of taking this type of measures, and then other countries even less than that, beware of technological breakthroughs. There could be a breakthrough in, well, a dramatic cut in the costs of solar energy. There could be a breakthrough in a new generation of energy, biofuels. And there could be various technological breakthroughs that we don't think are going to happen, but they might be there, that could have a similar effect on the value of extractive industries. The effect of other industries will depend on what happens, right? If there will be a large cost on emissions, a policy measure, that will be also a cost increase for energy-intensive industries. If there will be a technological breakthrough and renewables will become much cheaper, that in fact will be a lower cost to energy-intensive industries. So the effects on other sectors, they depend a bit on the drivers. Now, obviously there will be effects on a broader set of businesses than that even, because, well, think of transport, think of housing insulation, and a lot of sectors that are indirectly affected by what happens to the cost of fossil fuels. And, well, last but not least, and this is something very much a topic of today, governments will be affected too, because governments own a large amount of the fossil fuel reserves. The largest part, in fact, of coal, gas and oil reserves is not owned by private companies, but by governments like China, Russia, but also the Netherlands, the UK, and so on. In the study, we have to limit ourselves, so we only look at the direct effects, which means that we provide only a partial picture of the losses. So this is really a caution. We do not provide an overall assessment of what would happen to the overall economy and then calculate the potential impact on EU financial institutions. We look in particular at the extractive industries. So we look at oil, gas and coal mining companies, just at the coal mining operations of mining companies, and at investment in energy commodities. So, how did we research that? First, we mapped the exposures to high carbon assets. So with high carbon assets, I mean those extractive industries and energy commodities. We looked at pension funds. We had a selection of 23 large pension funds from 8 EU countries. Unfortunately, we could not include pension funds from Germany because the data for that were not available. But those 23 pension funds together, they were still a good selection, I think, because they represent about a quarter of the total EU pension fund assets. So that's over 1,200 billion in total in those 23 funds. Then we also analyzed the 20 largest banks, again from 8 EU countries. Together these have about 22,000 billion in assets, because it's a very concentrated sector. If you take the 20 largest banks, you have more than half of the EU total. We also looked at insurance companies. However, data for individual insurance companies are rather limited. So we used rough estimates based on aggregate data for the insurance sector. So what sources did we use to map those exposures? Well, for the overall asset distribution and for the commodity investments of pension funds, we used annual reports. For the equity portfolios of all institutions, we used a financial database, which has very detailed information about equity holdings in each company. So we used a list of, 800, 900 extractive industries, and we calculated all the equity holdings in all those hundreds of companies. And we did the same for syndicated corporate loans by banks. The largest loans to extractive industries and other large companies, they are not given by a single bank, so it's not just a bilateral loan. They are syndicated, meaning that several large banks sit together to provide that loan. And those syndicated loans, they are also available from a financial database. For corporate bond portfolios, so the bonds of extractive industries, we had to resort to a little bit more rough approach because those corporate bond portfolios are not available from the financial databases. So we looked at the overall size of the corporate bond portfolio and then used a benchmark for corporate bond holdings to estimate how much of that would be oil, gas and coal mining businesses. The reference date for the study is 31 December 2012, so about 1 year ago, or the closest date to that for funds that report, say, as of 31 March. Together, we arrived at total exposures of over 1,000 billion euros. So that's 1 trillion. Next, once we know the exposures, we apply potential shocks to those financial holdings. In the low carbon breakthrough scenario that we assume, we say that commodities, energy commodities, are going to fall in value either because of there will be a cost on carbon emissions or because there will be a technological breakthrough. The fall in value will be 50%. The corresponding fall in the equity value of oil, gas and coal companies will be about 60%. That's not the figure that we came up by ourselves. We took it from an estimate by HSBC, which also evaluated the potential impact on the valuation of firms. Bonds will take a larger hit, smaller hit, because first losses are absorbed by shareholders. Still, the ability of oil, gas and coal mining companies to service the debt over a period of more than 10 years, which is the average remaining maturities of those bonds, will be compromised. So we assume a 30% fall in value. The same for project and term loans provided by banks, and a slightly smaller loss ratio on credit facilities, which are facilities that have a shorter maturity, but in the event of problems at the extractive firm will be fully drawn. So it would still provide a substantial exposure and source of loss. These are potential shocks that we apply to the exposures. Now, applying the shocks to commodities, securities and loans, you get estimated losses. And we can express these as a share of assets, which is most appropriate for pension funds, or as a share of capital, which is more appropriate for banks. Now, if you want to assess the potential impact on the financial system and on the economy, we need to take into account whether these shocks will just be hitting shareholders or the financial institutions themselves, or whether these shocks will be propagated throughout the system. Various channels of propagation are possible. Take, for example, banks. If it's a small shock, the profits of the year will be lower. If it's a bit of a larger shock, the profit will be negative, or there will be loss, and the bank will see a depletion of its capital buffer. If shocks are serious, then banks might need to reduce their overall risk exposure, and their risk-bearing capacity is compromised. So they might limit credit provision to firms. That means there's going to be a shock to the economy too. If the shock is very, very large, then a bank might need a rescue from the government, at least until the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive is fully implemented. For pension funds, a small shock will come at the expense of their capital buffers, if they have some, because some pension funds are still in the negative. Then pension funds have a habit of reacting to large shocks by de-risking their portfolios to make sure that they will not suffer further losses. How pension funds react differs per pension fund, but what we've seen over the past years is that in response to the global financial crisis, many pension funds have sold equities that are high risk and potentially high reward, and they have bought long-term government bonds. Top-rated government bonds like Germany and the Netherlands and Finland, which provide a very low return but are much more safe. Now that has a major impact on financial markets. It drives down long-term risk-free or low-risk interest rates. It drives down the value of equities. So it affects other investors. And obviously in the case of pension funds and insurance companies, if the assets go down, if it's a large hit, then it will be passed on to participants. They will need to pay higher fees, and the pensioners will get lower entitlements. These are potential propagation channels. So far, the economy can be hit, but it becomes really problematic. Financial stability is only at risk if there will be feedback loops. Now, a feedback loop can look like this. If there is a carbon bubble shock, then the losses on bank loans increase. If losses on bank loans increase, then banks might need to reduce lending. That in turn will hurt the economy, and there you have a harmful feedback loop. This is just one example of a harmful feedback loop. If we look at risks to the EU financial system as a whole, we look at the possibility that the shock will be so large that there will be a propagation of the shock and that it will trigger harmful feedback loops. So this is our research framework and how we set out to analyze the potential shocks. Now let me quickly take you to the results for individual institutions. We're looking at pension funds here. I made a selection of the 23 pension funds for this slide. This slide shows what share of total equities for pension funds consists of high carbon equities. Now you can see on average it's about 13%, but there are very large differences between pension funds. The UK University Superannuation Scheme has a very high proportion of high carbon equities. The Dutch pension fund PFZW has a lower proportion. The Finnish Keva fund is about on average, and the Swedish Elective fund is much lower. So you see about a 14% difference between a low and a high carbon equity portfolio. That's really a large difference. Now, USS is a case apart because they already responded to inquiries by concerned people from the UK about the high exposure to oil and gas and coal mining industries. They said, we have no choice. We need to take these investments because we have an obligation to our pensioners, to our participants, to provide them with the best financial results. However, the same goes for the other pension funds in this graph. And you can see that even if all pension funds use this, or have this obligation, which they will do, still they can decide to take very different investment approaches based on that same mandate to provide a long-term financial support for their pensioners and their participants. Now, if you look at the overall exposure to high carbon assets, you'll see again some market differences. The USS fund has a very large exposure to its equity portfolio. The Dutch PFZW fund has also a sizable exposure, but it's mainly to commodities, because the Dutch pension regulations, they really favor the diversion, or the supposed the supposed diversification of risks to investing part of the assets in energy commodities. For a fund like KEVA, the exposure consists partly of equities and partly of corporate bonds. For insurers on the far right, you'll see well, the asset composition of insurance companies is slightly different. They hold less equities and more corporate bonds. Now, you see again the difference between funds is very large. Now let's go to banks. These are the high carbon syndicated loans as a share of total corporate loans. Again, you will see there's a very large difference between individual banks. On average, about 5% of loans, of corporate loans, is to oil, gas and coal mining businesses. For a bank like Société Générale, which unfortunately couldn't be here today, that proportion is much larger. For the Spanish bank, BBVA, that's also large. For Deutsche Bank, it's above average. But for a bank like Rabobank, traditionally an agricultural bank, but nowadays more diversified, they simply don't lend a lot of money, not to coal businesses at all, not to tar sands, not to unconventional oil and gas, but also not so much to oil and gas in general, which means that you'll see among banks a very large difference in exposures. If you look at the overall exposures, the picture is more or less the same. You'll see that for the EU as a whole, the average exposure of banks is about 1.3% of their total assets. That may sound like very little, but you need to take into account that banks, they provide mortgages, they hold a lot of government bonds, so the ratios that you're going to see here are smaller than for pension funds and insurance companies. Still, they're a major source of risk for banks. And again, you'll see major differences. Take, for example, BBVA and Rabobank, you'll see the difference is about 1.8% of total assets. It's a very large difference in exposure. One thing remarkable about this graph, another eye-opener personally for me, is that for some banks, like Lloyd's, the largest part of the exposure is to equities, investments. So even though some banks want to convey a message that they are back to traditional banking business, for some banks the real risks are still not in the boring corporate loans, but in the speculative investment banking businesses. And for some banks there's still a large risk in that. So the main scenario that we looked at assumes a low carbon breakthrough. And that really, I think, constitutes a wake-up call for the financial sector, policymakers and supervisors. We assumed, as I explained, a quick and definite transition. A quick and definite, that's important, so financial institutions know it's not going to be reversed tomorrow, but it will stay there. Financial markets will only then respond. It has the effect that there will be a sudden loss on high carbon assets. Well, we estimated the losses. We think it's unlikely to trigger harmful feedback loops. Looking at individual institutions, you'll see that the potential losses, again, for some pension funds are much larger than for others. The same for banks. Now, how large are the losses for banks? If for Lloyds you compare them, for example, to the profit of last year, the year before, profits, even the underlying profit will be wiped out, and about a fifth of the capital buffer could be wiped out by potential losses like this. Also for banks, again, I can't emphasize it enough times, the differences between financial institutions are huge. If you look at an uncertain transition, so emissions are eventually remaining within the carbon budget, but the transition path is initially unclear, then the main difference is that extractive industries will continue to make large investments for a long time. These investments are very large. They are now about 500 billion euros per year. So that will add to the amount of stranded assets, and that will only increase losses over time. That's why there's a price of doing too little too late. And also the uncertainty about what's going to happen in the future might itself become a risk for financial stability. Obviously, the third scenario that we look at, carbon renaissance, will be the most harmful. This scenario implies that there will be a strong increase in the amount for fossil fuels, but no effective climate policies and no alternative energy increase, so that the inevitable consequence will be that there will be a large climate change and large impacts on the overall economy, not just on the tiny fraction of the investments and loans of financial institutions, but on the overall portfolio, and for insurance also on the damages that they have insured. Now, to end, I'd like to briefly mention 5 recommendations we can discuss in more detail with the panel. One is for policymakers, that should be clear by now. The best thing to limit losses to the financial sector is to adopt clear and effective long-term climate and energy policies to make sure that we're not going to have uncontrollable climate change, to make sure that productive investments are going to stop as quickly as possible so that the overall losses will be contained to what we are today. Second, we have analyzed a set of financial institutions, found that the differences are large. We could only use data that were publicly available or available from financial databases, so we don't claim to have the full or completely accurate picture. To get the picture, we would need supervisory assessments. I think it's important to have those to know for sure where the risks are. Third, we know of some weaknesses already, some others might be discovered, and it will be important to address those because some financial institutions and some national sectors, they could be at risk. Fourth, it will be important, especially for pension funds and insurers, to promote active long-term investment strategies, because right now, well, like the UK-USA scheme, they say because of financial reasons we have to keep investing in these companies. But it doesn't really display a long-term risk view. So that's something that we would need in financial markets. And the fifth one is to adopt specific reporting requirements. There's a revision of the accounting directive going on right now, and from what I've seen so far, there's still nothing in it on reporting about energy and climate risks. So that's something to consider.
Thanks for the presentation. We have some time for Q&A, and Satu will take over.
Okay. I thought that I will take over just after the next when the next panel starts. But well, any comments, questions? Would Willem van Gelder like to add up something to the presentation, or okay, please, and everybody tell who you are.
Kuba Goleski from CE Bankers Network. I have a question. If in your analysis you did look at European Investment Bank, it's going to have a climate policy revision next year. I mean, starting at the end of this year, it's a fully EU accountable institution. So I think it's easier for the politicians and also decision makers also from here to make it accountable. So the question is, did you look at EIB?
Easy answer, no, we didn't. No, we focused on the private banking sector and on pension funds and insurance companies, so not on the public banks. Of course, you're right. It's easier to. There are other policy instruments to redirect the investment policy of the EIB than for the private sector. Yes.
Okay. Other questions, comments, please?
Satu, thank you. Mark Johnston, I work with the European Policy Centre. One comment, two questions. First, a comment on the very last point you finished on the non-financial reporting directive. Yes, I agree, there's nothing in it. It was a missed opportunity. I think in the new mandate, we should look to the new internal market commissioner to reopen that piece of law. I mean, where we are on the process is there's a trilogue agreement and it will go to plenary next month as a done deal. So the new internal market commissioner ought to be tasked with looking at that, to reopen it and to insert a chapter on disclosure of fossil assets stroke liabilities. That's the comment. The question, one for the speaker and then the second question for the Green Group. Francis, so I mean, and including what we heard on video, overall, yes, we're heading for a crash. However that plays out in detail. But is it possible for you to say where the first blood on the carpet might be witnessed? Not so much in banks going down, but in fossil companies going down. For me, looking around Europe, yesterday RWE reported its worst results ever, its first loss in 60 years. It seems to me that company in particular, because its balance sheet relies on so much lignite sitting in the ground, not far from here, as it happens, is probably the most, from a financial point of view, probably the most unstable big energy company and Europe's largest polluter. How long until that, in the case of that company, for example, how long until its instability becomes significantly apparent? Second question to the Greens. I mean, and thinking more broadly, what's your strategy with this initiative? Climate politics in Europe is broken today. The summit in 2 weeks' time will fail to make any progress on climate change. We have an emergency summit tomorrow on another security crisis that may or may not make progress, but the global climate crisis is not on the institutional agenda in any significant way. So where do the Greens see that as the radical group in this House? Are you trying to bypass public policy with a focus on the financial system, or do you see public policy in some way recovering? And the image that came to my mind a few minutes ago on that was a bit, if you think of Frankenstein's monster, do we need to apply a large dose of electricity to the institutional machine to wake it up to the crisis that we face? Thank you very much. And so either to Reinhard or to the other Green Group members in the room. Thank you.
Okay, would you like to answer first about whose blood will we see on the carpet first?
Yeah, I'll pass it to Jan Willem.
Yeah. I don't think in the framework of this study there is anything to be said about that. We didn't study that at all. It's more the overall picture of the consequences for the whole fossil fuel extractive industry, which we looked at. Also excluding actually the type of companies you are referring to, RWE, because we didn't look at the electricity sector. Yeah, it would be very interesting to have a follow-up study on the consequences for the electricity sector, and the pictures could be very mixed. As Francis already pointed out, it depends also a bit on what type of climate policy is enacted and also the technological developments. Yeah, the dependency of RWE on lignite, of course, is worrying from a climate perspective, but not necessarily from a financial perspective. I don't think we are here to comment on that. But having said that, I think it would be very important to have a follow-up study on this type of industries and the consequences of the carbon bubble, and also the consequences for the financial markets for these. industry is heavily dependent on fossil fuels.
Thanks. And Bas, looks like you would like to answer the question for the Greens.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Whether we need some electricity to the institutional side of the story. I think in the end we will certainly not try to work around the EU, the policy institutions, because in the end you will need public policies as well. We all know that. But I think the purpose also of this study and this approach also clearly shows that what we're looking for is making clear that the issue of climate change policies are not only from an environmental perspective important, but also from a financial, from an economic perspective. So broadening the scope of the issue that also makes sure that different institutions at the European level, but even more important at the member state level, will see this issue as not only a pure environmental issue, but more and more as a financial, institutional and economic issue. And I think that is the importance also of this study, indicating that maybe even if you think that climate is not the most important issue now, that by looking at what this study shows is that the financial system, which got a lot of political attention the last 5 years, as we all know, that through the carbon bubble, the stability of the financial system is even more at stake through this system. And I think that is hopefully also waking up a bit other policymakers which are not necessarily always inclined to think of climate change at first.
Reinhard.
Adding two remarks to that. One is policymakers are two different breeds. One part is dealing with the issue of climate change and the other is looking away. One effect of this study could be to get a couple of people involved that have avoided looking at the issues in the past. And by doing that, adding new thrust and adding new emphasis. And the second, I just want to remind everybody what an impact the Stern Review had in 2006. What the Stern Review did was not adding a whole lot of new information about climate change per se, but adding a lot of information about possible economic impact that changed the conversation. And I think some of this, what we're doing here, trying to do here, could have a similar impact.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that legally, business and political decisions are the different categories, but in the real world, there is an interaction. Perceptions in business have an impact in thinking of politicians, and when too many politicians believe the traditional business lobbying message that environmental policies are against our competitiveness, against our business success, against employment, etc., that has an impact to political decisions. But when the perceptions in business change, that also has an impact to the thinking in politics. So I think we can't cut the world to different pieces. So everything has an influence to everything, and so I think we need to work on. We need to use all possible tools that are available, and I think the understanding of the risks to the financial system can be compared in the novelty of this idea to the Stern report. Stern report is not anymore in the minds of prime ministers and Barroso, etc. It's already considered an old story. There are people in business and in governments and finance ministers who have understood the message of Stern report, but there are many others who took the message for a while, but then forgot it. And maybe this potential impact to the economy via the financial system can play a similar role in spreading the understanding. But, well, you have another question?
Yeah, very short one. I understood that the pension funds and the banks analyzing the study are mostly from France, Netherlands, let's say the western part of Europe. And as we are trying to broaden the spectrum, we have some member states that are especially innovative in looking at the climate issue, especially from the east. So I wonder whether it makes sense or whether it would be possible to broaden the scope of the study, let's say, for the financial consequences on the financial sector in Poland, Czech Republic, Estonia, etc. Because even though the players are much smaller, the broadening and making this notion of risk to the financial sector go through make a political difference.
Well, I would, of course, be totally in favor of having a follow-up like that. We made this selection of pension funds and banks because we looked at the largest ones to cover the largest part of the EU financial sector. But you are right that we do not have a picture for all European countries. It also means that there might be some countries at risk because of high exposures of national sectors that we haven't even looked at because we had to limit the amount of institutions and the amount of countries that we could look at. Yes.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Mark Campanale. I'm from the Carbon Tracker Initiative in London. I want to welcome the report, which is an excellent study, and it's great to see how you've plotted which financial institutions have the exposure to unburnable carbon. There's two areas which I think it's important that you've done. The first is that you've framed this as a financial risk issue and the fossil fuel exposure pension funds not as a moral issue, as a financial issue, and I think framing it in that way has been very important. There's a couple of areas which you've not looked at in the report, which is, as we know, fossil fuel companies are the highest payers of dividends to pension funds. I think in the UK, one company alone, BP, was responsible for 20% of all dividends paid to pension schemes. What would be the impact of missing out on these dividend payments as a potential risk? The others, you don't talk about capital expenditure. Our estimates is that $7 trillion will be spent in the next 10 years on exploring for more coal, oil and gas. Now, if 80% of what exists can't be developed and burned, that's a huge potential risk, the 7 trillion being lost essentially to the banking system. The last is, if you think this is a regulatory question, what are you saying to regulators about how you can calculate where the risks are in the system? Do you have any sense of what would be the information that you would have to work out as a regulator to find where the risks are? Because at the moment it looks like most are not even aware where the risks are in the system.
Okay, thank you. Those are some important questions, I think. Thanks also for the compliments. I think the questions about dividends and about capital expenditures, let's try to link them. The figure that we mentioned, the 500 billion euros of ongoing investments per year, that's the same actually as the 7 trillion of dollars over a 10-year period. So what we mean by the price you're doing too little too late is in fact that these ongoing investments, they will, as you rightly point out, increase stranded assets and increase losses. So these companies, they would need to decrease these investments. What effect would they have? They would have a larger part of their profits available to pay out as dividends. So in fact, if new capital expenditures by oil and gas companies are going to scale down, it means they'll have more cash available to pay out as dividends. That's the only thing they can do with it then. So in the short term, that should not be a problem for pension funds at all. On the contrary, it would increase pension funds' income from dividend payments. Then about the regulatory aspects, I think there's an important difference here between banks on the one hand or banks and insurance companies on the one hand and pension funds on the other. Banks and insurance companies, they are mainly regulated at European level, supervised still mainly at the national level, but it means that there is a clear framework for supervising these companies and supervising how they manage their risks. It also means that national supervisors have a lot of powers to request all kind of data and information from these companies to assess in detail, and much more detail than we can, where the risks are. We couldn't look, for example, at the type of projects that companies are financing. How risky are those projects? One oil project is not as risky as the other oil project because the one is more high cost than the other. Those type of things we didn't look at. Nor do we have all the details about the type of financing, what collateral they have, how secure they are, how the conditions are, etc., etc. This is something that banking and insurance supervisors could do. They could provide a more detailed, more broad picture of where the risks are in the system. For pensions, that's different because pension schemes are mainly regulated at the national level. And regulation focuses on the duties towards participants. So the focus is really on proper administration of pension rights, of proper management of the interest of workers on the other hand, on one hand, and pensioners on the other hand, in case they need to increase premiums or cut pensions and so on. There's very little supervision actually on the investment policy. That's considered a responsibility of the fund itself, and in the end, a responsibility of the employees, the employers, and the pensioners to decide on. However, macroprudential authorities, so mainly the central banks, they do have a responsibility to make sure that national sectors are not overexposed to certain risks. So I think for the pension sector, there is an important responsibility for central banks, and they should really look at this issue more closely.
Thank you very much. And now I think we have used the time for which has been reserved for Q&A. Okay, we'll take still one question and then we... Okay, 2 quick questions and then we move to the next panel. Please.
Thank you very much. Appreciated that you squeezed that in. Nina Renshaw from Transport and Environment. I wanted to ask a question about the other side of the equation, if you like. I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that some pension funds are kind of de-risking, moving towards low return but stable long-term returns from government bonds and things like this. So a question really to you, but also to the policymakers in the room. Is there a way of looking at the kind of climate positive investment side of the equation? If we're talking about divesting extremely substantial amounts of money from harmful investments for the climate, and these would then be freed up for climate positive investments, what role would policy have then in being able to direct these? I mean, the EU funds have been rather disappointing in what they've freed up for renewable energy and energy efficiency investments. How can regulation then shore this up with what comes from private sector investors?
Take the second question on the row.
Thank you very much. Ben Aveneur for OGP, Oil and Gas Producers. I have a difficult but exciting role to play here to share maybe two elements. I have several of them, but I will limit myself to 2 elements I would like to share with you. The first one regards the prospect, the future. If you look to figures, by 2035, 60% of EU energy needs will still be met by oil and gas products. And by 2050, it will still be a significant proportion. So if there is no access to new oil and gas reserves, we are putting Europe in front of a big problem, which is energy shortages, which will have impact on transport, on electricity, and on household and eating. And an additional problem, and if you look to the actuality today, what is happening in Ukraine, it will make Europe still more dependent from third countries for providing oil and gas to Europe. And I don't think it's a very sustainable approach.
And the second comment I would like to make, based on what I could understand from the debate, which was very interesting, I must say, refers to the current reserves. If I got it properly, 60%, according to you, 60% of the today reserve should not be used if we want to meet the CO2 targets. I guess there is a misperception about what actually reserves means. There is the physical reserve of oil and gas, what you have beneath the underground, and what is actually the commercial produced reserve, which are two different elements. So let's make it very simple. If you have a reserve of 10, for instance, physical reserve, that doesn't mean that you have a commercial reserve of 10. You will probably have a reserve of less. So I guess your figures would need some fine-tuning in one way or another, and we would be very pleased to build a further dialogue with you. Thank you.
Well,
the IEA says 2/3 should stay in the ground. The IEA wrong?
Yeah. And the figures 60 to 80%, that's, I understood, global reserves, because climate change, that's a global issue. But would you like to comment?
Yeah, well, I would like to comment on the first question on the pension funds and their shifting to other types of investments. I think it's actually an exciting debate, which is just starting or has started the past, let's say, 5 years in the EU wide. There's a big pressure on pension funds to rethink their role as investors in the economy, and yes, there's a lot of potential to invest in more climate-friendly industries or solutions or adaptation or whatever. But it has to be further debated or worked out how this should actually happen and how this should be linked to the primary task of pension funds in maintaining pensions for their participants, etc. First step, I think, which is also coming very clear from this study, is that pension funds should and could be much more transparent on where they're investing in. We have only researched a limited number of pension funds, and of them not their full portfolio, most of them, because of a lack of data. And there's no reason, different from banks and insurance companies who have more client issues, client confidentiality issues. There's no reason for pension funds to be not transparent about their investments. They should be, and they could be, and that would help the whole debate by trying to compare between different pension funds and by looking at different options. This debate on the role they could play.
About the second question, first let me say thank you for being here, because I think it's great that you're joining this debate. About the technical question, the reserves that might be stranded for 60 to 80%, technically those are the P1 oil and gas reserves and coal reserves, so excluding P2 oil and gas and coal resources. About the energy scenarios, as a researcher, I'm not going to choose which scenario is most preferable. I'm just pointing out that in a scenario where energy use is not going to diminish and energy mix is not going to change, and indeed the EU and the rest of the world are going to use a large part of fossil fuel reserves for energy generation by 2035 and onwards, it means that there will be very large climate impacts. That then seems something inevitable. So it's just a choice of scenarios there. As a person, I would say, I have children and I would like my children to be able to take a flight and to have a happy life at some time. So as a person, I would say, let's spare a little bit of those resources for the next generation. But again, as a researcher, I must say this is up to politics to decide what policies they're going to pursue.
I would like to comment also that on the energy mix, There are different scenarios. There are business as usual scenarios. There are climate scenarios. Also, IEA has produced very different scenarios, some based more on business as usual, some based on the technological potentials which are already there, which are already existing and commercially available technologies. And the results you get of what is the energy mix in 2035, 2050 are completely different. And well, it's understandable if oil and gas companies think that the only possible future is that we continue our dependency on fossil fuels, but there is the policy factor. There are people who vote in elections and people who think that we need to make it possible for our children and grandchildren to have a decent life, and that can have an impact and has had an impact to the development of the energy mix. But now I would like to thank the first panelists and presentation of the study. And let's move to the second panel. And I would like to invite the panelists of the second panel to the podium. Jason Anderson, WWF, Silja Varmola from Keva Pension Fund, James Cameron from Climate Change Capital, and Didier Millero from DG Markt, EU Commission. And Bas, would you like? Okay. Somebody brings your names, I suppose. Yeah.
Is it okay if I speak first as on the program?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for joining. And I propose that we follow the order which we have in the program, so that Jason Anderson is first. Jason, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the authors of the report, which was very interesting. And I'm going to leave it to the financial experts on the panel to describe a little bit more about how to react to the risks that this report describes to the financial system. But I want to focus on a very important aspect of the study, which is the scenarios that describe the pace and ambition of our decarbonization effort. Because really, the study's analysis is predicated on the idea that we are committed to staying below 2-degree warming, and we make the steps necessary in order to have the political commitment and the technological changes to doing that. But there are also two other scenarios aside from the rapid change one. There's a sort of an uncertain transition where you still stay below 2 degrees, but you wait until longer and have more drastic measures, more costly measures later on. And then there's the idea that you don't actually adhere to that environmental limit, and you have a reversion to a carbon-intensive model, which has the implications for the impacts of climate change itself. So I'm just wondering, in which world do we currently live? All right. So in some respects, we're certainly witnessing rapid change, and you can look at the statistics. Since 2008, half of the world's added electrical generation capacity has been renewable. So non-hydro renewables, mainly wind and solar, were 70% of European capacity addition in 2012. China got more generation from wind in 2012 than from nuclear, and it added more generation from non-hydro renewable energy than from fossil and nuclear combined. That included a whopping 12 gigawatts of photovoltaic solar. In the United States, not exactly the model of climate change action, the energy intensity of its economy declined by 50% in the last 10 years. And Texas, the oil state par excellence, gets 10% of its energy already from wind energy. And if a country were to want to install the same amount of photovoltaics that Germany installed over the last 10 years, in the coming 10 years, it would spend 1/3 the amount of money for the technology that Germany did. That's the pace of change that we're dealing with right now. And so despite the slow pace of change in the international climate negotiations, there's actually action at the national level that is relatively encouraging. You have policies around the world, which was highlighted in the recent Globe report, which include economy-wide targets like you have in Mexico, but also more sectoral ones. So in the past decade, the reduction in deforestation in Brazil has outpaced the emissions reductions from the EU and the US combined. And in the field of investment, we have seen some encouraging signs, which Kuba pointed out, and the work that we've participated in with Bankwatch and others through WWF's Seize Your Power campaign has focused on European banks, the EIB, the EBRD. We didn't get everything we wanted out of their reviews of energy policy, but in the case of the EIB, they increased the shadow carbon price, and they put in place an emissions performance standard, which should come close to ruling out coal, which is something we think that should be put in place for Europe as a whole. And the EBRD, in their review, their presumption against coal could largely rule that out of their lending portfolio. So these are also accompanied by other changes in Europe and North America in public lending that are pointing in the right direction. But as Europe prepares for the 2030 climate and energy framework, there's a debate raging around us that all of us who are involved are witnessing, which is the sign of other scenarios at work. Resistance to policy that would act decisively to get us off of fossil fuels and onto renewables is facing resistance from a highly vocal set of actors within the economy. The Magritte group of 10 big energy company CEOs that has got together are sort of the canary in the coal mine for the carbon bubble. You might have seen the report that I think came out last week from Greenpeace that points this out very well. They've made the wrong investment decisions, and they've missed the boat on renewable energy, and they're suffering the consequences. Rather than saying, we're going to buckle down and we're going to get rid of coal, we're going to find an appropriate role for gas in the transition to a renewable economy, they're shooting in all directions, including at renewable energy and energy efficiency policy. And they're relying on a story about an emissions trading system which is more effective than theory would dictate, and certainly than reality has shown in experience so far. Perhaps that's what they're counting on. Depends how cynical you are. Now, energy-intensive manufacturing has played a very skillful mantra of victimization at the hands of climate and energy policy, getting to the point where it actually dominates the agenda of the upcoming European Council meeting on the 20th and 21st of March, which was supposed to agree the climate and energy policy for 2030, but looks like pushing that into the long grass. In fact, of course there are reasons to pay attention to energy prices, and of course we're concerned about the competitiveness of European manufacturing. But if you look at what factors are really important to competitiveness in European manufacturing, not even the CEOs of these companies would put energy costs at the top. If you look at studies and surveys, you know, their real challenge is the availability of researchers, scientists, engineers, skilled labor. These are at the top of their challenges to remaining competitive. Energy prices are only 7th out of 10 of the factors of the recent Deloitte study, for example. Now, the IEA says that EU manufacturing is likely to increase in absolute levels between now and 2035. And in 2035, EU manufacturing will still be more than double the share that the US or China has. So it's not a doom and gloom scenario as such. So what we're witnessing is not a battle over climate change policy as such, but the intersection of competing principles of prioritization. So in the one case, you have the overriding need to assure that the public is protected from climate change, and on the other, the central aim of business, which is to maximize financial returns within the confines of a particular risk and reward system that they're operating in. Of course, there are also other principles besides corporate profit playing an important role. Now, last month I was in London and I debated Lord Brown, former CEO of BP and now chairman of Quadrilla, the fracking company, about fracking and shale development in the UK. And one of my central arguments was that we need to pay attention because of the carbon bubble to any new extracted resources. Essentially, our primary challenge is not to find new and unconventional ways of getting fossil fuels out of the ground. It's to find new and unconventional ways of keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And Lord Brown's primary rebuttal astonished me, which is that if there are those resources there, it's Britain's patriotic duty to extract them. I was gobsmacked. But perhaps that shouldn't have been so surprising, because anywhere you go in the world, if there are fossil fuels, there's a reason to extract them. You're an environmental, responsible, nice guy if you're in Norway or Canada. You're fighting American imperialism if you're in Venezuela. You're doing it for development if you're in West Africa. You're doing it because it's the easiest and cheapest, low-impact way of extracting it on the Arabian Peninsula. There's always a reason. With so much at stake, it shouldn't come as a surprise that there's a debate about the need to combat climate change at all, and that there's a particular line to be drawn in the sand, whether it's 2 degrees or otherwise. It comes in Europe in the phrase rebalancing environmental protection against security of supply and competitiveness, as though you could reduce a little bit of environmental security, environmental protection, and increase the other. They're just fungible. We're just sort of balancing the chair. It's evident in the way that I've heard the chemicals industry here in Brussels question whether global warming may have slowed down to a stop and if perhaps we're just overblowing the whole thing. It's evident in the way petroleum countries produce analyses and forecasts that they claim are completely dispassionate, that something will happen by 2035, not predicted to happen, not modeled to happen, will happen by 2035. They're all showing the world far off track from avoiding dangerous global warming, but they call these real world and non-ideological, and they generate an air of fatalism. In other words, resistance is futile. Yeah. In Europe, there's an even more facile argument, which is to state that whatever the desire to tackle climate change, Europe won't be where that happens. We're only 12% of world emissions. You often hear this from the steel industry, which is only 2% of Europe's GDP, but 12% to them seems like a very low number. So one of the pension funds in this report that is most exposed to fossil assets, the university's superannuation scheme, because of this picture, was recently able to testify to the UK Parliament that essentially he questioned whether or not policymakers would be able to implement policies that cause the bubble to burst. He cited the failure of the EU ETS. In other words, go ahead, write your reports. We don't think anything's going to happen to us, but we have to prove them wrong, and I think we can prove them wrong. Despite the pessimism in the power games, in the corridors of European capitals, in the streets, people get it. So you look at the most recent Eurobarometer poll, 7 out of 10 Europeans think that energy efficiency and renewable energy can boost the economy, including 7 out of 10 Polish people. 9 out of 10 Europeans think it's important that national governments set targets for renewable energy, including 88% of Polish people. So in this democratically elected House, going into an election, it's vital that we connect with Europeans' concern about climate change by facing the issue head on and pressing forward with rapid change. And I look forward to the comments from the panel about how the financial sector plays a role in that.
Thank you very much, Jason. And now the financial sector. Silja Varmola, portfolio manager from Keva, Pension Fund Finland, taking care of municipal pensions and some other parts of the public sector pensions. Keva was mentioned in the study as one of the pension funds where the fossil assets have a bigger share than the average of the pension sector in Europe, and it would be very interesting to hear your comments on what do you think about this issue and what are your plans for the future.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to the organizers, and thank you for the report. I've read it, of course, and so have some of my colleagues, and it's already raised the topic within our organization, so a good start. Like Satu said, I think we got the invitation to speak here as we were highlighted as one of the pension funds most at risk from this carbon bubble bursting, so to speak. And, well, of course, you got our attention, and when I saw the numbers, they seemed a bit high to me, so I wanted to do my own calculations. So I know we're not here to talk about us as such, but I'm going to show you my numbers anyway to start with. I have a full see-through into our investments, and a large part of our equity holdings are external. So hence, you only saw a slice of our investments. That's mostly the direct portfolio of equities and some Asian mandates that we have for external managers. And as you can see, very big part is outsourced to external managers. Plus, our investments are quite global. So you saw Europe and a little bit of Asia. And based on the calculations that I've done, my estimation is that our exposure is around 7% of equities. That translates into 3% of assets. It's a high number, of course, but still it's not quite as high as you highlighted in the report. And that's the sort of feeling that I had as I'm dealing with our portfolio every day, and I know what's in there. Well, but anyway, it's an important topic. I hope we're going to have a good discussion about the subject. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few steps back, I'm going to talk about Keva just a little bit so that you know the scene. So we are basically the pension fund for the local government sector in Finland. We're an independent public corporation, and basically we finance and invest the monies of the local government sector. So the fund itself, it's a pension liability fund. It was established in 1988, and it's basically a buffer fund, which means that we're still getting more inflows every year to the fund than we're paying out as pensions. So we're in a healthy situation in that sense. And if we think about the sort of decision-making authority at Keva, well, at the top we have the council, who in turn appoint our board of directors. And these two bodies represent the will of the people, so to speak, as the composition is a reflection of our municipal elections. So basically, we have many politicians on our board. And lastly, I spoke about our equity investments already, but maybe just a broader picture of how we invest and where the money is. So we do have a big allocation to equities, and well, this is one of the reasons why we stand up in the report as well. But also quite a big chunk of fixed income and some alternatives. And if we look at the law, it says that our investments really must fulfill some broad requirements. That's safety, profitability, liquidity, and diversification. And that's the big picture that we have from the law. And in the report, you sort of promoted long-term active investment strategies. Well, I can speak from the heart that it's really a focus area at Keva. So we are mainly a long-term investor. And I know this because I work every day within the selection of the external managers that we have. And the one thing that we seek and the one thing that all the managers need to have is a long-term investment horizon and a sort of own fundamental research-driven investment philosophy. And hence, their exposure to these high-emitting firms is much lower than, for example, in the passive indices. So they don't really think that these companies are that good investments as a result. And well, why am I here as a speaker? I am heading Keva's Responsible Investment Steering Group. That's a group that we formed 2.5 years ago as we wanted to have more people involved in this type of work. Previously it was only me, but now I have colleagues from all the investment units. And the purpose really is to coordinate Keva's work in responsible investment, share information, well, just raise topics of interest and discuss. And we work with our CIO in cooperation, and well, the study and the subject is something that we are going to discuss in our meetings, and I have already discussed with our CIO. And we signed the UNPRI in 2008, and that's something that we use as a general principles of how to incorporate responsible investment. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Mr. Cameron, founder and chairman of Climate Change Capital, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to all those who are attending, and thank you very much for your analysis of the report, which I read and enjoyed. And I've been trying over a number of years to make some of these points to other institutions, and I'm very happy to see the work of Carbon Tracker, but also I'm on the board of Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, so there's a nice link with that work. Just very briefly, for those who don't know, Climate Change Capital is an enterprise that I founded with my colleagues about 10 years ago. It has a purpose to create wealth worth having. Having spent all of my career working on the climate change issue in various ways and having negotiated international conventions on climate change, I wanted to do something to encourage finance to flow towards the solutions and to properly understand the risk involved. And although I don't come from the financial services sector, I thought I could form a business bringing people into that world. And so we have asset managers with funds focused on property, green buildings, private equity, growth companies in Europe, developing technologies like LED lighting or solar PV installation or battery storage for mobile phones, things that create efficiency gains in the economy. And we also have a fund that invests in projects around the world driven by a price for carbon, at least when there was a price for carbon, which is largely driven by the relationship between the Kyoto Protocol and the EU emissions trading system. So we have about 1.6 billion under management, and we have an advisory business that works with companies of all different types, but is largely focused on transactions in sectors like renewable energy, energy efficiency, and in the transition that we hope we can play some part in encouraging. So many of my comments arrive out of the experience of building a financial services business with a purpose, and the difficulty of communicating, being a bridge between the world of public policy and the world of finance. My sometimes frustration at trying to connect with the financial system, which is structured in such a way, it makes it extremely hard to make these systemic arguments. So much of the system is organized around boxes. You have to place your arguments, particularly if you're trying to raise money, in the right box. Not just an equity box or a fixed income box, but which sector within it. And then an awful lot of the thinking of the financial services sector is reductivist. They want to narrow down, they want to rule out possibilities, they want to make simple comparisons, this stock or that stock, this bond or that bond. A lot of the people who I brought into my organization have a very different way of looking at the world than me. And it's quite, I offer this just as an attempt to find understanding between the way, if you've worked on these systemic environmental issues, it's so frustrating not to find a way of connecting with how the financial services system works. But unless you bother to understand how it works, there's not much hope of changing it. So, first of all, the unburnable carbon idea, I think, is a sound, a solid idea. It works conceptually. It's nice and simple to just observe. If you're serious about committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's atmospheric chemistry driving the analysis. There are numbers, there are performance targets, there are metrics that help you understand whether you're winning or losing. It's a highly complex system, but you can visualize what it looks like to have a budget. And I think this is a good concept. But it's not at all easy to connect that to how the financial services system works. There are other aspects of the unburnable carbon debate which are related to the stranded assets debate, which sometimes are easier to explain. For example, the consequences of the physical effects of climate change on physical assets like infrastructure or property. But even that's very difficult. When we went out to raise money for our property fund, I could visualize the document that we used, but I can also still see the faces of incomprehension on the other side of the question. Why have you got a climate change property fund? What does that mean? So I remember I thought it was a simple thing. We've just showed them a slide that says, well, it'll be very simple. We won't be buying properties in the flood zone. It had no connection whatsoever. But why? Well, if you look at the projections for floods in Europe, we show maps of the UK. We said, look, here's the Environment Agency's view of floods in the UK. This is the Met Office's view of the floods in the UK. This is the insurance industry's assessment of risk, properties at risk in the UK. Therefore, our property fund will not be buying properties in those areas. Really, most of them thought it was irrelevant. Right? Well, one of the properties we looked at and rejected, turns out, would have been affected by the recent floods in the UK. Now, I want to go back to those guys who looked at me with a blank face and say, see, but we have to do better than that. Our property fund didn't buy property in the flood zone. It does work as a financial investment. It does produce financial reforms, and we do have metrics to display environmental performance, CO2 reduction, energy reduction, water reduction, even though none of those things are specifically valued in economic terms. But we know that relationship with the tenants has improved. We know that when we try to improve buildings, we can work with tenants, and often they put more money in to improve the stock that we own, right? Contrary to the myth that there's no point being an owner with that sense of responsibility because you only pass the benefits on to the tenants. That turned out to be just not true in real life. So stranded assets can also be looked at the consequences of physical damage, physical loss. Right? And that sometimes resonates because institutional investors and their sub-managers are driven more by the fear of losing than they are by the excitement of winning returns. The other issue that emerges from your report, but indeed others, that I think, and Carbon Tracker has done this, the Oxford Smith School work on stranded assets has done this, HSBC has done this, but there's a lot more to do here, is the practice of valuation. As an outsider, I find some of the reasoning, some of the technical arguments for valuation of fossil fuel companies funny. I mean, it induces a reaction of laughter. So, for example, you can have a serious conversation with a mainstream analyst in the fossil fuel sector, and he or she will tell you that they do, by the way, they value the reserves as if all the capital that is available will be used to exploit all of the reserves. All of the reserves will be exploited. All of the exploited reserves will be sold into a marketplace using today's commodity values. Even if they couldn't be taken out of the ground for another 10 years. And here's the things they don't take into account at all. At all. Future regulation? No. Public protest? No. Resources that are not currently valued, like water? No. If you list, and Mark's been on this for a long time, if you go to London, which is a very attractive place to list fossil fuel companies, mineral companies, exploration companies, and you get good lawyers, good bankers, insurers to do a nice fat report, and you come to the market, the chances are there'll be nothing in that report if you're mining coal somewhere about water. There'll be no mention of a possible conflict over access to water resources. It doesn't feature. So ask yourself, is it likely that any of those things, those events would happen in the next 10 years? Would there be a change in regulation? Would there be public protest? Also, would there be substitutability? Would there be another technology or another resource that could find the same function? Do you value any of those when you value a stock exchange listing a company today in fossil fuels? None of them get valued. And what that does is it allows tracker funds to pile money into the indexes in companies that have, therefore, stronger balance sheets, they have capital to invest, they spend more money looking for more resources. The same people will view a solar PV company as small, of course, because it's not as big as these. It's small, technologically risky, and it belongs in the tech sector, not the energy sector. Right? This is how it works. Produces systemic unfairness. It concentrates power in the incumbents. It makes it really hard for newcomers. So I would argue that the valuation techniques of the sector have to be fixed. They have to be fixed within. You could do a bit with public policy. That would be great. The financial regulators should definitely look at this. And by the way, I think it's a financial conduct issue. Because those people who are selling or brokering those companies on the London Stock Exchange or anywhere else are telling the people who are buying them, who ultimately are individuals with their pension funds or getting excited about the rates of return of minerals companies, they are the owners ultimately, and they're telling them there's no risk for any of these things in the future. Right? Which is wrong. So I think there's a financial conduct issue as well as a systemic risk issue that needs to be looked at. The other thing that happens, of course, is that and this was picked up in a question earlier, you can make coherent, plausible, effective arguments about risk and revaluation, but if you want to shift towards something that looks like a solution to these environmental risks, you've got to have alternatives ready. And we really do have a problem that we don't, in the sense that we don't have large listed equities that could be recipients of a tracker fund or a big listed equity business. If you want to make a pure clean energy investment today, it's really hard on a main stock exchange. You can invest in a smaller company that has growth potential, but it's really hard to make that selection. You have to buy something that's mixed, either a utility with more renewables than dirty fuel. You mentioned the RWE example. You can make choices within that sector. You can make choices within the fossil fuel-based energy sector, but you can't really invest in a pure play. There are some examples, but very few, and not enough to fill a portfolio. So one of the challenges is to get some of the smaller companies big enough to break through into that sector through acquisition. Now, here's an idea. This is going to be a bit, forgive me if it's a bit technical, but institutional investors have to find a way of replacing the dividend yields they depend upon with other yields that they can depend upon to meet their long-term liabilities to their beneficiaries. This is a question of asset allocation, but it's also a question of being confident enough in the security of those returns over a long period of time. So we have a challenge to mimic, to replace, to substitute that dependency for another that is cleaner and greener and has sustainability attached to it. Right? So I'm interested in a few examples. In the States, a utility called NRG has taken off its balance sheet its clean energy assets and put them in what I would call a pure play, which very cleverly they've just called Yield Co. Right? Straightforward. Right? They've same management, but different structure. So they've taken, in this case, in their view, gas and renewables, natural gas-based power and renewables, put them in a new company called Yield Co. They did it last summer. Massively improved. Performance, funny enough, of both the old and the new have gone up, but by a lot. The Yield Co, last time I checked, had gone up about 28%. 28% for a utility. Right? And they then raised a bond to invest more in renewables. Right? That's interesting. That's interesting. I think we could do more of that here in Europe. But you have to have those alternatives ready, and it has to be in the right boxes. It has to have the right shape and profile of the things that these institutions are interested in, but they have to let go of what they already do. Final point is that many of the arguments that you face here in Parliament, but certainly in all of the regulatory bodies, is that the incumbents are extremely strong. They're very persuasive, and they know how to make simple arguments effectively that encourage the status quo to remain. And one of them you hear over and over again is, of course, competitiveness. And it almost doesn't matter that it's nonsense. Right? The competitors' arguments are almost always nonsense. because regulators don't dare call their bluff. The arguments appear to be clear. If you regulate us, we will leave the jurisdiction. There will be job losses. The brand names are familiar. The steel companies, people know them. Sometimes they have long histories. Sometimes they have British on them. Right? It's very difficult to say, but actually, one of the reasons why we must maintain a price for carbon, for example, is because we want to be more competitive. And there are lots of companies you've never heard of who have alternatives to steel. Maybe not in every sector, but in some. So just take this one example, partly because it is an investable alternative. The automotive sector is a significant sector for Europe and for European competitiveness. There are global markets, for good or ill, whether you like or loathe cars or you've got a problem with performance of companies. Let's just take it for the sake to make the competitors' argument. But it's something that Europe does, that there is a demand for in the world, where there are significant returns to the European economy. Ask any designer in any of the major automotive companies in Europe, are they looking to the future to build their vehicles out of steel? No, they are not. Right. Some components, but increasingly as little as possible. What is the dominant issue that they are concerned with? It's really to do with weight to power. So that makes alternatives really interesting. Aluminium, yes, but mostly composite materials. Who makes the composite materials? Where do the ideas come from? Throughout Europe, certainly in the UK, we have brilliant scientists working on alternative materials, material science, world leaders. We also have, to date, small manufacturing businesses using those materials. Most of the people have never heard of them. They've heard of British Steel, but they have not heard of the Bristol Composite Materials Group, right? But if you hold the line, if you call the bluff of those making the competitors' arguments, and you keep pressure on the constraint on emissions, you encourage creativity, and smaller businesses like that get bigger and better. They provide a product into a global market. So at the moment, those companies will be seen, those alternative companies, as small, therefore higher risk. They don't feature in the index, and that's an issue we've got to grapple with. We need more risk capital, but we also need to build bigger enterprises that can force their way into the listed equities index. But the fact is, they are an alternative to the companies who are incumbent, who make special pleading arguments to the regulators, and they benefit from the constraint that comes from a price for carbon. So in sum, we need to connect the risks associated with unburnable carbon, stranded assets and the like, with the opportunities to move to investments that, in my view, and it's my company's view, will produce in the longer run better and more stable returns for investors and a more competitive European economy.
Thank you very much. That was encouraging. But, well, when you speak about putting the ideas to right boxes, that sounds very familiar for also a legislator, because if you have an idea about how you want to change the society, you have to find the right legislative boxes. But our last speaker is Didier Millero from EU Commission. Please.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman, and thank you for having invited me to this high-quality panel and discussion on issues which are obviously of great importance. It's a challenge for me to be the last speaker after all these interesting things and messages which have been exposed already. But I will try to give you a positive and encouraging message here in terms of what policymakers, legislators can do, and that story is about the non-financial reporting directive, which has been mentioned already by some speakers. Of course, I will not be able to cover all the different policies or policy initiatives or existing policies which are relevant to the topic which we are discussing today, but I think that that angle is already an interesting one. And I think it's an example of how we can actually connect what I would qualify as the traditional financial services, regulation policies, company law policies with more long-term investment or long-term considerations issues, like, for instance, the protection of the environment or the need to take good account of the consequences of climate change. So I really believe that this example of the non-financial reporting directive is very topical in this respect. So what are we concretely talking about here? It was a proposal from the Commission dated back to April last year, whose purpose was to introduce a very simple new obligations on companies, asking them to include in their annual financial statements a report, a statement about the impact of their activities on the environment, on the on different social issues, but also on issues related to the respect of human rights and fight against bribery. So very, let's say, straightforward and easy obligations when you present your financial statements, basically when you present to the public the situation of your companies in terms of your financial health. You also need to add information about what is the actual impact of your activities on all these issues, and these include the environment. This obligation does not exist at this stage. It is new. It exists in some member states. Countries like France, Denmark are very much ahead in this respect, but it's far from being the rule. And in total, we have made some assessment in our preparation of the directive. You only have around 2,000 to 3,000 companies who are already, either because they are obliged or because they have taken themselves the initiative to do so, but you only have a couple of thousands of companies who actually have been engaged or have taken the decision to be that transparent. The potential of transparent company, of course, is much bigger when you look at the amount of large companies in the EU. We're talking about 30 to 40,000 companies. So we thought that there was a big potential in terms of increase regarding the number of companies that could be more transparent. And the rationale behind this is also very clear to us. We think that by making sure that these companies become more transparent, they will have strong incentives, they will be strongly encouraged to look at the way they are internally organized, look at the way they manage their business on a daily basis, and also look at the way they design their long-term strategy, because it means that they will have to integrate all these considerations. They will have to look at their risks, the risks which they face in their daily business, in different areas, environmental, social, human rights, as I said, and probably in the long run they will become more able to face these risks and more resilient, and probably also, and we can make that statement on the basis of the experience of those companies that are already transparent, they will probably also be more competitive in the long run. That's really the feedback which we get from companies, and if I may put it that way, the bet which we take that this will be the case if that directive is going to be a success. So as I said, a very simple obligations that we wanted to link with, let's say, additional provisions in terms of how do you control the quality of that non-financial statement. How do you make sure that the right information is there, while in the same time not, let's say, overburdening companies in terms of obligations, and not also being too, let's say, prescriptive in terms of how the companies should actually design or prepare these reports, because our directive has the vocation of covering the whole spectrum of the EU different types of sectors and economic sectors and businesses. So it's very difficult in a single piece of EU legislation to describe in detail how this assessment, which all companies we believe should make, has to be made. Some companies obviously have bigger challenges in terms of climate change or environment. Others are facing more issues related to the way they treat their employees. For instance, those companies having big affiliates of subcontractors in emerging economies. So it's difficult to factor in all these issues, but at the end of the day, we believe that we managed to get a good balance in terms of providing for the right guidance on one hand, but also having some flexibility, some needed flexibility on the other. It's been a discussion, a negotiation that started last April and actually is about to be finalized now. So let's speak about 9 months, which in terms of EU negotiation is not so bad, I have to say. Of course, we had the big incentives of the coming elections. That is always a very good way to convince people that a deal needs to be reached. But it was also sometimes a bit of a difficult discussion because the points are made about the usefulness of such reporting requirements and the advantages which it produces for the companies is, as you may imagine, not necessarily shared by everyone. For instance, the idea of putting in place an obligation to report was challenged by some member states, but also challenged by the representatives of the industry in the EU. We really had to struggle to convince people that this was the right thing to do. It's always interesting to be confronted with the following argument. We are doing it already, so why do you force us to do it? But then we reply, okay, you are doing it, but others don't do it. If you believe that it's good, why don't you also accept that we force them to do it? So it's a bit of a catch-22 debate, but at the end of the day, I think we managed to at least take that further step, which is to have an agreement on the concept of a legal obligation to be included into a piece of EU law. But that was one of the most difficult, let's say, aspects of our proposals that we had to discuss. A second difficult point was the issue of the scope of the new reporting obligations. We, Commission, would have liked to have quite a significant number of companies concerned. This would have entailed both listed companies, the big companies having access to regulated markets, but also the non-listed companies, because we think that there are many actors out there who have decided not to raise capital on regulated market, but still have a significant impact in terms of their activities on the environment and social matters. This was also a very difficult point in the negotiation. And unfortunately, at least from our perspective, we did not manage to convince the legislators that it was, at least at this stage, a good thing to also cover non-listed companies. So the final result in the directive is that it will only apply to large listed companies, including the so-called, that's a technical word, the public interest entities, which cover small banks, small insurance companies, and also small listed firms. But as a result, the scope is much less wide as we would have wanted. And according to our current assessment, we will actually cover now something like around 6,000 companies instead of the 18,000 which we initially wanted to cover. In terms of how, and I would like in this respect maybe to reply to criticism that has been expressed during the debate this morning. In terms of how you design the reporting obligation, how prescriptive you are in terms of guiding the companies in terms of what they have actually to put into the statement. This was also a difficult debate because, as I said, we are covering quite a wide range of issues, and there was resistance mainly among member states to be too prescriptive in this field. For instance, you could have imagined that companies would have been called to to report on key performance indicators, or you could have imagined a system whereby companies would have to report much more, that the legal obligation would have foreseen much more detailed reporting environments. For instance, in the field of the environment, you could have imagined that a declination between climate change issues, water use issues, or air pollution issues, but this is something that was not retained at the end of the day. But it doesn't mean that, of course, companies that are confronted with these risks should not be able or called upon to report on them. And I think that's a positive contribution to the debate which we have been having this morning. And the last point of controversy which made the negotiation a bit difficult was the issue of the need for an audit of the quality of the statements. We, Commission, thought that it would have been a good idea to ask an external parties to check the quality of that reporting requirement. And among those third parties, you can find auditors. There are also other professions that could do that, but auditors are an obvious candidate. The co-legislators did not follow us in this respect and only agree on a very, let's say, limited third-party control requirement. Basically, at the end of the day, the Commission is satisfied, mainly because we have managed to take that step, which moving towards a compulsory obligation, it's something which is new in EU law. You could argue that it's limited success, but on the other hand, we all know how difficult and how challenging it is to get 28 member states plus the European Parliament agree on something. There was an obvious, let's say, not opposition, but debate between the Parliament that was pushing towards more transparency, obviously, and the member states who were split, but with quite a few of them being, let's say, a little more reluctant. So at the end of the day, I think we can be satisfied that we managed to take that step, and that at the end, the result will be that more companies will have to report. It's a step. It's maybe not the final one. There's a review clause in directive that is inviting the Commission to look at the way the directive has been implemented, and we will have to produce a report in 4 years. So let's hope that we will be able to book some success at this time, and we will see also at that occasion whether it would be a good idea to extend the number of companies covered or not.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we have again time for discussion, but now I would like to ask the first question myself, and it's partially linked to the point which Silja Varmola mentioned, that a big part of your assets are outsourced. And well, and the reason I mentioned this is that I think that a panic in financial markets plays always a role when there is a big problem and a problem that is suddenly understood. So I think that, for example, the estimate on what is the percentage of the risk or order of magnitude of risk for the EU financial sector as a whole in the report. This report, it's based on, as I understood, on the assumption that everybody functions rationally. But we have seen that financial markets are not always rational. For example, a collapse of a fairly small bank in USA caused big turbulence in the whole world. And for example, the story of the Greek problems, many people have commented that it would have been hardly felt in any way if when the problems in Greece were understood, the rest of EU would have fixed the issue. But because there was some uncertainty, there was a lot of companies who have own each other's shares and who started to feel uncertain about the value of their assets, and this kind of chain reaction with panic has has worsened the crisis, multiplied the crisis, and I would like to hear if our speakers have any thoughts about the potential impact of climate-linked panic in financial sector, what the impact could be. Because we don't know what will be the issue which makes enough decision makers both in business and politics to understand the seriousness of climate change. I believe that this will happen, but we don't know how that will happen. If that's a new version of Hurricane Katrina affecting London and Brussels, Paris, Berlin, or what the issue will be, and if it's something that creates like a sudden rapid understanding which people have tried to avoid understanding until then. Do you have any ideas about how the impact would look like?
I do, but there are lots of them, like there's lots in that question. So, first of all, to endorse your point that markets really don't behave rationally. They have moments of rationality and then they have movements, and most of the market will move following someone else. Right? And I force myself to read every day a blog from the bond market, from a guru in the bond market, and it's very, very instructive to read their perspective on world events. Right? I've actually met the guy, and he's a great character, but it scares the wits out of me. I can read the same event, and it's interpreted in this way, and the way he's communicating to his customer base, the shorthand way, the instantaneous evaluation of a public policy decision or an event on the border of Ukraine, it's in the bond markets in a nanosecond. Right? And it's good education to read those things every morning, but that tells you that, yeah, there is some rational analysis in it, but he's a market leader. People will follow him. His customers will follow him. And you can see how contagion happens. You can see how spirits move. And so let's just assume that your analysis is correct, but then it makes it very difficult for you to have a rational argument on what you do about it, right? Because you're not ever going to be so much in control of all these events. The next way, I think, way into this is to understand that these are very useful and attractive and, I think, instructive scenarios, but they're not pretending that they're real. They're ways of trying to get to grips with the problem. So scenario analysis is good learning, it's good preparation, but we all know it's not going to be like that. So just as an example, if we're right that there will be a tendency to continue to invest in creating the risk, that money will continue to pour into more and more exploration, then there is a game to be played by investors and indeed the leaders of these energy companies to try and extract as much rent as possible out of that marketplace, either before there is some binary event, quite unlikely, but there could be some binary event, some sudden loss, or in order to hedge, i.e. to extract the rents from a higher price and use it to invest in the alternatives. Now, you're beginning to see signs of this, not strictly speaking in the energy companies, who have largely divested themselves of the alternatives. In fact, we've been involved in a number of those transactions, advising on the sale of renewable energy assets out of energy business. So, but you can see it in some countries. You can see it in Saudi Arabia and in the Emirates, where there is now massive investment of fossil fuel-based revenues in alternatives, alternative fuels, in solar, in trying to anticipate what the replacement will be for the very thing that causes their wealth to be accumulated and distributed today. So there is a potential for a hedge to take place, which would send all kinds of different signals than the ones you're anticipating, i.e. with the price going up for a while and then being moved across to smoothen out the transition. Right? That would be rational, but it depends upon there being attractive returns from the alternatives. Now, the last point you mentioned, which one would hope is not the only way we can organize our institutional decision-making life, but we simply wait for more crises to hammer us, and then eventually we switch to some more dramatic intervention. And your analysis, just like the Mercer and Grantham Institute analysis, properly, in my view, attributes the most cost to delay, and then sudden switch. So you hope that we could keep making these arguments so that the natural hedge from high to low carbon becomes the sensible response, whether you're an oil exporting nation or you're holding a lot of fossil fuels in your portfolio, or indeed if you're a leader in the energy industry who really wants to bet their career and their future on the alternatives rather than on the fossil fuel base. Because they're the folks that actually will build the corporate capacity to take the institutional investor money and apply it to a different kind of energy system.
Celia, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the question of what if a panic happens in the financial market. Well, psychology always plays a role. And if there was a panic due to a sudden event or whatever, it would mean that the shares of certain companies would all collapse. And that's, again, an opportunity for the smart investor, because all the companies get punished, but maybe there are some that are investing in renewables, or, you know, they're not all the same. And I think it also relates to your earlier point about how the financial community values these yes. firms. Well, we believe that if you base your investment decisions on the sell-side broker research, you're not investing, you're gambling.
Yes. Yes.
So it's, for us, it's an opportunity,
yes.
because we want to find people that do their own research. They look 5 years out, 10 years out. They are prepared. If there's a panic, they take advantage of it. So we might be a little bit different than many institutions, but we are really striving to get away from the passive indices. We've done that for years. But that's an approach that Keva has, and I think others might not. But if you do that, you're investing in the past, not in the future. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. You again?
Okay, I thank you for the presentations. They were most enlightening. Question to Ms. Formola from Keva and Mr. Cameron, if I may. And just before this, I make one comment to Mr. Cameron. I think there is one very problematic assumption with your notion of having high rates of return for the alternatives on the same level as the rents for fossil fuels, because it assumes that we maintain the same level of growth and the same level of economic thriving as from before the crisis. So there's a strong assumption. Now the questions. Did you ever analyze as an alternative to invest in EU ETS CO2 allowance permits? They are an effective bet, and we are now suffering from a chicken and egg problem. The industry, the fossil fuel industry, is betting on them to be low. But if the investors wanting to have the transition rapid and public institutions, investment pension funds start investing in CO2 emission allowances, you're effectively driving the transition. You become an interested stakeholder in the process. You have an interest to put the price up and to get the public acceptance for this. So the question A is, have you actually analyzed this as a possibility for alternatives? And if yes, what is your assessment of the current risk? And what would you need, for example, from legislators to do it as safer investment for your institutions? Thank you.
Please.
So first, the rates of return point. You're right to challenge that. It depends very much where you are in the world, what sort of growth rates your economy as a whole are experiencing. My point was slightly different to that. I was trying to emphasize that the markets on the whole have not priced the risk in the incumbents properly, nor have they priced the risk in the alternatives properly, and that these are relative shifts. It's true, it's very difficult to make the case on the last few years that rates of return for investment in various alternative technologies are high at all. I mean, it's incredibly mixed. There have been some very good companies that have gone down. Some of our investments, including in Europe, in solar, that we thought were the best, have suffered immensely as a result of the rapid decline in price of solar PV, for example, through investment in China that's been heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. Now, you know, I was offering a global perspective. I wasn't particularly focused on, for these purposes, on alternatives within Europe. It's also a very confusing picture because in some respects, I would rather like a less excitable conversation about rates of return altogether, so that we might build infrastructure for the future with expectations of lower but steadier returns, and that infrastructure would be capable of receiving these new technologies. So if you build an intelligent grid, for example, preferably, says he in his dreams, a pan-European intelligent grid, then that's a long-term investment, massive capital outlay, but it enables lots of other technologies to flourish that currently are small compared to the incumbents. Okay? But there are growth markets. You know, renewable energy in some of the emerging economies is growing very rapidly and producing fantastic returns. So we have not done the analysis precisely as you described, but the principle you offer is correct, that those who benefit from a price for carbon clearly favor one that's relatively high, and those who will be punished clearly favor one that's either low or not there at all. But there are some interesting transitional phases. So within the fossil fuel industry, clearly gas beats coal with a higher price for carbon. You dramatically increase the relevance of a whole suite of energy efficiency strategies, whether it's in buildings or in production, or indeed, just to use the example again, in alternative materials. I mean, if you're building a car with composite materials, you don't need so much space, because literally the production line doesn't need to be so long. You need less energy in order to bring the components together. You can distribute the manufacturing very widely. You can have a design that's on the web and it gets manufactured in a small town. There are dozens of efficiency gains associated with the use of that material. And they all benefit from a price for carbon. So you're right, at some point, I can't give you the number. We had this experience with the early days of the carbon market when the price went above 25, and psychologically, that did flick a switch. And ironically, and rather tragically, it meant that we then produced an oversupply of credits. So the capital markets responded with outlaying a lot of money. We produced a hell of a lot of carbon reductions at extremely low cost. And then, unfortunately, the governments didn't hold their part of the bargain and set sufficient demand, and therefore oversupply meant collapse in price, or at least one of the reasons why there's a collapse in price. But we saw that even before you got to some, if you like, academic magic numbers, like post 40 euros, for example, you can make a strong case for a transformation of the energy system of Europe. But long before that, I think you have a psychological shift where all the key actors realize this is for real, and they start to adjust and they start to find value in the alternatives.
Yeah, on your question about the emission rights, well, we have actually done some work on that, and we've invested in the rights. It's not me, it's a different team, so I'm not really an expert on that. But that is sort of a natural hedge that we have in the portfolio. As we have other natural hedges against the sort of high emitting firms. But sure, I mean, why not? We've done the work a little bit. It's not a big part of our portfolio at all, but still we have some of the emission rights, yeah.
Okay, there is one question, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Wolfgang Weber from BASF. It may well be that indeed in my sector, investors and companies are still a bit, some of them may be unaware and ignorant of some of the risks that you try to highlight here. And we will certainly look into this report closely. We have been there now for 150 years and think in terms of the next 150 years. But maybe, and that's what I would like to comment on and also ask one question. Also, on the other side, I feel a bit still, if I may say so, unawareness, and I basically now refer to the competitiveness issue. I mean, there are products in our sector where energy is 60–70% of the costs. I do not know what CEO should tell you that this would not be an issue. Because Mr. Cameron, you a few times reported on the materials. One nice example, and also that I'm happy to comment about because it's not my own company, that's carbon fibers. Carbon fibers for the car industry, and BMW builds now cars basically where the whole is made of carbon fibers. Do you know where they're produced? They're produced now in the US because their electricity is so much cheaper than in Europe. So the question is, does that make sense for Europe if we think in terms of competitiveness? So basically what I want to say is, I think that's at least how we try to put this, is really to have this balanced view on a sustainable investment that looks at competitiveness and also on climate change issues and regulatory costs from climate change, because we are well aware what happens in the European Parliament. Satu Hassi Bas Eickhout, we are aware of what happens, so we would be stupid not to do that. But so the question would be then, if you could comment, and also what do you think about, maybe to you, Mr. Cameron, but also to Ms. Varmola, what do you think about indices like the Sustainability Dow Jones Index or the Climate Disclosure Project? Because this is how we also try to get in touch with you, investors, and those stakeholders. Thanks.
So let's deal with the competitive issue first. All right? I'm very glad you're one of the few people from your industry that has used the correct opening phrase. There are products, particularly in your industry. There are products within the steel industry too, where there is a genuine competitiveness issue. Right? It's very, very rare that it's the whole sector. And it's never an excuse for reducing the regulatory intervention required to deliver a public good by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There may be one or two products where, particularly in the chemical sector, because of the way in which chemical plants can be constructed relatively quickly, close by the availability, I would say it's more to do with the availability of natural gas, cheap natural gas, than necessarily electricity prices. And I think even in those situations where there are particular products that are, one, internationally traded, two, where there's a big difference in the energy input costs, and three, where there is sufficient availability of expert staff because you can move people, into they can be employed readily. There are very, very few countries in the world where you would move your business to get all of those attributes. Now, it happens to be that the US is one. It's largely to do with gas, and it's almost nothing to do with the price for carbon. So even in the relatively few examples where, as I said, product by product, there is a genuine competitive issue, there is not a pan-European competitive issue that's got anything to do with the price for carbon. And also, you know that you can manage a price for carbon. You're a sophisticated company with good management skills. You can deal with it. And when institutional investors ask you and others who come here and raise the competitive argument, is there a competitiveness issue associated with the price for carbon? I don't mean this you personally, but many of those who make the competitive argument to parliamentarians or commission officials when their investors ask them, is there a real competitive issue from the price of carbon? They say, no, actually, it's fine. We manage it all right. We did very well. We were over-allocated a few years ago. We've got lots of carbon to sell. Price is very low. It's no issue. What they might mean, if they're being straight, is if the price goes to something like 40, then that would be seriously material. But they'll have plenty of time to adjust, and there are loads of efficiency gains that could be achieved along the way. Now, the other dimension, which is never mentioned, is that there are lots of European investors who own your stock. And say we buy every aspect of your argument, and you really do have a competitiveness issue on a particular product. And so you move it to manufacture it in the United States of America where it's cheap. If European institutions own that stock and the profits are being returned to them because you're now making more profits by manufacturing in the US, you tell me where the competitive effects is to the European economy. We've got the returns. Thank you very much. And we can invest them in something else. All right? So for years and years and years, I've listened to these competitors' arguments. I did a study when I was at Yale Global Environment and Trade Study. We found almost no evidence of any company ever moving anywhere as a result of regulation of the environment. And the few occasions where it happened, it was egregious. And I want to say, if you've got a corporate leader who's prepared to stand up and tell his staff, we are leaving the European Union because we're not prepared to pay a price for our pollution. You're all losing your jobs, I'm so sorry. We're going to go somewhere dirtier in order to produce this product, and then we're going to sell it back into you as a consumer. I'd like to film that farewell speech. I'll put it on YouTube, all right? And that's why you should hold the line if you're a regulator. And then, you know, it's true that it's necessary to have genuine alternative arguments for economic growth and development, whatever level you think is appropriate for well-being and prosperity in your economy. And you're right that the chemicals industry has got lots to offer in that respect. And the derivation of many of those products, for the time being, is coming from fossil fuels, a lot of them. So this doesn't have to be a binary switch or an absolutist or fundamentalist argument. But increasingly, people are trying to make materials from a bio base. You, indeed, and others are doing that. That's happening. They all benefit from a price for pollution. They offer real alternatives. And, you know, there's a general point I'd like to make, which is that human society, if you ask any artist, ask an artist, not an industrial developer, but ask an artist, creativity, how does it emerge? What really makes the creative urge express itself? Often, almost invariably, there's restraint, there's constraint. The artist's canvas is a constraint. The definition, the understanding of what a poem is a constraint. You create within it. Engineers do the same. They love to be told what the limits are. They understand the physics of limits. They don't like waste. But often our financial sector tells them, just don't worry about that cost because we'll sell the product. Someone will pay for it, and the externalities are paid for on the whole by the public. So it doesn't feature in the constraint. All we're doing here with carbon pricing is adding constraint and then saying, be creative within it. And I think we'll build a perfectly successful and prosperous economy with that kind of constraint.
And Silja, did you want to comment also?
Yes, you asked about the CDP and such initiatives. Well, we've been supporting that one for years, also the water disclosure project. And as an investor, what do you really want to do? You want to get a financial value for all the tangible and intangible assets that a company has. So you need information. So we think it's very important that the companies participate. Yes, so please keep doing that going forward.
And Jason, please.
I know you're using the carbon fiber example as just an example, but you said that it was produced in the US because their electricity is so much cheaper in Europe. Now, I would be astonished if any product was made in a particular company, in a particular country, absent considerations like, do they have a skilled workforce? Do they have engineers? Do they have the infrastructure? Do they have the market to sell it to? et cetera, those are actually much more influential factors in the overall picture of competitiveness than the electricity price, because there is no electricity price in the US or in the EU. There is a whole range of electricity prices in the US and the EU. And in fact, if you map state or actually market electricity prices around the United States and Europe, they go like this. You know, Europe is not actually just above the US. It's a much more complicated picture. So I have to concur with what was stated, that obviously competitiveness is of a concern, but there's no simple answer and there's no simple problem statement. And I would argue that within manufacturing industry, the kind of investments that you need to see to invest in those low carbon technologies which exist and which in a range of heavy manufacturing industries could be put in place given the proper incentives, given the proper markets to sell into, given the proper investment, is going to require exactly freeing up the kind of capital that is currently invested in high carbon infrastructure into those new solutions.
Well, I have noticed some requests, Sanjay and then you, and well, I think that when we need to close quite soon, so when Sanjay is speaking, I hope the rest who want to say something ask the floor, and then we go to the final comments.
Okay, I'll be super brief. Firstly, thank you, James. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to somebody speak very articulately and very intelligently about some really complicated problems. My question is, I think to the whole panel, and it's really, sorry, I'm Sanjeev Kumar, founder of Change Partnership, an environmental NGO. My question is to solve the problem, we have to go back and look at the purpose of corporations as well as the financial markets in which they operate. So how would we engineer this change? It's very easy for us to look at a top-down approach through a European regulation, such as we've been talking about earlier. At the same time, there was something quite historic that happened last Friday in the US. That was during Apple's board meeting, their annual general meeting. There was a big fight between the climate skeptic organisations who wanted Apple to stop investing in environmental goods because they weren't getting the returns of the rate of return for their shares. And the CEO actually told them to get out of the company. Don't buy Apple shares, because the purpose of Apple is not to make profit. Not just to make profit, sorry. And this takes us to it's a slight faux pas. This takes us to the real fundamental question, which is that we live in a confused world because we're following the myth that the purpose of a company is to maximise its returns for shareholders. Now, there's no legal basis for that anywhere. And until we get to grappling with that, it's going to be very difficult for us to start unpicking not just the financing of carbon, but also the kind of activities that corporations do for whatever reasons they do it. So how would we bring about this change? Do we need to support more and more the companies like Apple and allow this to be an organic bottom-up revolution, or do we need to be kind of pursuing the avenues that Didier was outlining in terms of looking at the next 4 years for the review of the non-financial disclosure directive? What do we do? It's an open question.
Thanks, and we take the second question also.
I'm Danny Bates. I'm a researcher for Jean Lambert, who's a Green MEP in London. I've just got a question relating to the price of carbon. In the UK, as many people will know, there's a carbon floor price, which is a level higher than the level of the ETS. And the examples, I suppose this is primarily a question to the report writers, but maybe others could respond to if they've got some comments. And that price is clearly, higher than the ETS price, which we know is far too low anyway. But it seems, from as I understand it from here, that hasn't been enough at all, to even that higher level price, to have any impact, at least on the UK data and figures in the report. So I suppose my question is, would the carbon price need to be way, way, way higher, and therefore the whole question of pricing is really problematic, or whether it's maybe just a case of that carbon price isn't capturing these investments somehow because they're in other places? We
go to the answers, and if very, very short, and then we go to the answers and possible final remarks of the panelists.
Satu, thank you. James, would you like to be the next UK-nominated European Commissioner? and behind that is just, you know, if we don't fix the politics, we can't fix the policy. And the anomaly we have, you know, among the 6 largest member states, the UK is the only one that is seriously wanting to organise on the climate crisis, and yet because of the politics between here and London, you know, the Secretary of State was here 2 days ago, the UK is effectively naked in the room because its strategy doesn't add up. So if you could get your namesake to nominate you this summer, we might be on the way to fixing that. Thanks very much.
Nice last question, and then to the comments of the panelists.
That's very. Yeah, you're going to come back, I'm sure, on something. But thank you very much. Very flattering, and well, you know, put the request in. I mean, all right. So let me just deal with the purpose of corporations. Totally agree. If you go back into the origins of the joint stock limited liability company, there are some elements in that early Dutch and British invention that ought to be revisited. The joint stock limited liability company had a clear mission. It told you what it was going to do, how it was going to share the risk, and what it was limited to. It said, if I'm going to the East Indies to get nutmeg, I'm going in this vessel. I'll return hopefully by this date. There is some space in the hold if I find some other spices. Who is going to finance the vessel, absorb the risk if it gets shipwrecked? Who wants the nutmeg? How much of it? Who wants to buy space in the hold? Right? And then I promise you, I'm only going to go to the East Indies to get nutmeg. I'm not going to divert it and go to the West Indies and get sugar. Right? So you were clear about the mission. You had a risk profile that the market could understand. You financed the physical goods, and then you distribute them into a marketplace. Well, we've allowed that to become an increasingly sophisticated, but sophisticated in a stupid way. The complexity associated with a modern-day corporation means that it's pretty much impossible for anybody to understand what every part of a large corporation does, which in turn makes it equally ridiculous how well remunerated those are who run those corporations, because they can't possibly know what's going on in all of them, and so they shouldn't be paid as if they could. So I think it's a great moment for revisiting the essence of the capitalist system, to try and find the positive elements of that for enterprise, delivering outcomes that will increase our prosperity. Now, I'm quite interested in the B Corporation movement, which seems to be gathering strength. An old friend of mine from Argentina, Pedro Tarac, has been doing amazing things in South America. It's really caught on now, which I think is interesting. Culturally, they seem to have been attracted to the B Corporation idea, Sistema B. It's quite limited at the moment. It's almost like a badge of honor rather than a different corporate structure. I'm very interested in how we might take that on and build what I call public goods enterprises, which have some similarities with trusts, but are not private, in the sense that trusts can be very secretive and hard to interpret. The National Trust in the UK is an immense institution, does a lot of good work. But I prefer to have something that's more open and transparent than that. We've had some lots of experimentation with cooperatives, publicly owned utilities. You described your company as an independent public corporation. I'd like to find out a bit more about how that is structured, what its legal base is. So I think there's a moment of innovation we've arrived at now to rethink corporate structures that allow us to be better at delivering public goods and better at limiting, being clearer about the objectives of these enterprises and therefore holding them to account. Your point on carbon pricing, it really does depend on what you want the price to do. So I'm now feeling more comfortable talking about carbon value, because I know in some instances a price signal will be insufficient. It won't be as effective as some plain old regulation. for example, a building code. There's clearly a value associated with carbon if you require buildings to meet certain standards that include measurement of carbon. But it's not necessarily a price signal. It gets priced in, but it's not a market price signal. On the other hand, a price signal is brilliant for where there's cross-border trade. So many, many years ago, I was a big advocate for a carbon tax in Europe, and I lost heavily in those battles. And when I negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, I can remember vividly feeling that this is over. We're never going to get anything that looked like harmonized or coordinated tax. But we might be able to get a tradable mechanism established that values carbon between countries. And that eventually led to the Clean Development Mechanism, which is both a good and a bad story. But it tells you that for some incentives where you want to encourage capital, in particular, to cross a border, but do something different this time, a price signal is necessary in a diverse and mixed and difficult to regulate economy. And ultimately, you're absolutely right. There's a difference between politics and policy. Right? If we can do a lot of technical work to get the policy right. We do know that if we send price signals out, capital markets will react, and quite quickly. Politics is hard. And it's very hard when there are more immediate crises in your face. But that's exactly where you have to win the battle. And I also think that your focus on the financial sector is extremely smart, because that's a genuine power lever, and it can be pulled on their own terms to good effect.
Thank you. And other answers or final comments by the panelists?
Yes, I'd like to make one final comment. I was triggered by the mentioning of legal requirements in Finland, such as liquidity and diversification for pension funds investments. These kind of legal requirements are often invoked to explain certain investment strategies, but it strikes me, well, it struck me when we did the analysis for the study, that pension funds in all European countries, they all have that type of requirements, but they differ per country. So you see, it strikes me mostly for the investments, not just in equities, but in commodities, which I think for your fund is also another half a percent of assets. And you see in a country like Sweden, pension funds are prohibited from investing in commodities just for the sake of generating returns or diversification. In the UK, it's allowed, but even a fund like USS, which claims they have to, put to the financial perspective of the participants first, they put a lot in equities and they don't invest in commodities. For funds in Finland, they put a little bit in commodities. In the Netherlands, there's, by regulation, there's an incentive, again, not an obligation, there's an incentive for funds to invest a lot in commodities. So they have even much larger commodity portfolios, which for me is very surprising, that even if there is an obligation for all pension funds to operate in the financial interest of their participants, apparently you can interpret that in many different ways. And if you look at the overall impact, or the potential impact of the financial carbon bubble on the EU financial system, the best you can do for most of the investments is to redistribute them. I mean, the equities exposure are there. If one pension fund sells its shares, someone else, be it a pension fund, be it a bank, be it a rich person which can absorb losses better, someone else has to take over that investment. It's not going away. The one type of investments, the one type of exposures that you can really reduce is in commodities. Because it's not a necessary investment. It's not something that you can simply stop to finance and then the exposure then no more. No one has to take it over. So in fact, that's the easiest way to reduce the overall exposure of the EU financial system to the carbon bubble, to stop financing commodities, and it frees up money for pension funds to make real investments, to do something more, I'd say, more productive with their capital. So I think that's something that requires some consideration in various countries too.
Okay, thank you. And Celia, please.
I guess, well, you're absolutely right. Our allocation to commodities is quite small, and I guess that shows that maybe we don't believe in that much, but those sort of decisions would be up to our board to make, not the sort of doing part of the organization like myself. And I guess the final comment that I would like to make is that we certainly don't want to underestimate the threat of a carbon bubble, as we're interested in the returns that we get. And I'm sure that is a real threat. But then again, we need to worry about quite many things. Well, just lately, the situation in Ukraine, what does it do to our assets? Chinese slowdown, different kind of credit bubbles. So this is one of them. And all I can say is that we are thinking about it, we're discussing it internally with our managers, and as I showed, the exposure actually isn't as big as you maybe thought beforehand. But we have many worries, and this is one of them.
Okay. Thank you. And would you like to have some final comments? Yeah.
Actually, I think, not to twist the final comment, but I think the fact that this is just one of many worries is part of our problem. It's just another factor. People are unsure, both in their own lives, in the work that they do in corporations and in government, how to interpret whether or not climate change is simply another risk factor to be considered at some point, or if it has an overriding character. And I don't think that we can necessarily blame people for thinking that way. It's a matter of a continuous process of impressing upon them through reports like this what the impacts will be. And, you know, I just want to point out that the description of what the options are for the financial markets with respect to fossil fuel investment reminds me very much of work I did around sport utility vehicles a number of years ago, Hummers and so forth. Basically, you find that in certain places, as people buy more of these monster vehicles, other people feel unsafe and essentially feel forced to buy another large vehicle in order to feel safe on the road. And they value their private safety. That risk is valued more highly than the impact on the environment and other kinds of things. And similarly, if as a private individual you know that you're going to retire in 25 years, and you anticipate that we are going to have an inadequate response to climate change, and you're going to have to protect yourself and your family, then you have a choice. Let's suppose that you have a solid fossil fuel investment that gives you a 4% return, or you can go for a slightly greener tinged investment that gives you a 2% return. The 2% return over 25 years will increase your investment by 60%. The 4% return in the fossil fuel company will increase your investment by 150%. And I think this is where we are in society, is this question of, do we look out for our own, whether that's our own selves, our own corporations, our own countries, or do we have a broader view? And finding a way of linking those two things up between the better angels of our nature, which understand the risk, and the decisions we make at a private level or a corporate level, is the essence of the policy challenge we face right now.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Miller, would you like to have a final comment?
For the sake of time, I will keep it very short and say that I wouldn't mind having James as my next boss if he's available.
Thank you very much. And so, on my behalf, I would like to express my very warm thanks to all panelists and also for the interpreters. And now I give the final word, concluding remarks to Bas Eickhout, my Green colleague from Netherlands.
Thank you, Satu. And I will be short, also given the time, but also I think it's always difficult to summarize such a very interesting event with all these very great panelists and great research being done. So then, of course, as a politician, you have to be modest after such a morning and just be very thankful for all the information, I would say. Just a couple of observations that I would like to share with you just to conclude with is of course that the purpose when we started, and I think Reinhard was the initiative, but together Reinhard and me and Satu, when we started on this research and the topic that we would like to address, it was clearly to see that the issue of climate change needs to be linked to other broader issues than just only environment or energy. And I think over the last couple of years within the Greens we've been very successful in embracing the issue of green economy, which already is making clear that environmental policies are not old style going against economics, but just can go together. I think now the next step is also to link up these kind of policies to the financial stability of our entire system. And I think that this study, this topic, but certainly also this study, clearly shows how important the issue of carbon bubble is towards the stability of our financial system, which of course in the end is also the basis of where our economy is lying on. So in that sense what we are doing as Greens is further and further broadening all the issues that we would like to cover. Also because, and that is of course I think something to the pension funds, when they say there are many issues that we are covering that we need to look at the same time, you'll be surprised how often these issues are related to our fossil economy right now. Also, if you look at the power of Russia towards Ukraine, the reason why they're so powerful has also a very clear basic. And in that sense, yes, there are many issues you have to look at, but sometimes it is surprising to see how much in the end is geared towards our current fossil economy, and I think that is also important. I think that is also something what James said, that the markets do not always behave rational. Well, I would say they are very rational because the only thing they do most of the time is just business as usual, thinking along the same lines, which is indeed not rational, but you can explain why. They have been doing that for decades, for centuries, and therefore, I mean, Wolfgang, you said BASF, they've done that for more than 100 years. So it's difficult to change your thinking towards other things. And that is the problem also of policymakers, but also of investors, when they are just thinking along the same lines they've been used to for the last decades. And I think that is also the importance of addressing these kind of topics. It's not only, I mean, in the end, yes, there are a lot of policies that need to change, you're right, Mark, but also what maybe is even more important is that we have to change our thinking and thinking of people outside this room, because of course inside this room a lot of people are aware of the issues, but outside these rooms a lot of people just think along the current business as usual. And I think that is something that we have to change, because if you just look at the discussions on, for example, how to stimulate renewables, then all the time we are looking at the prices, and for example then the infrastructure suddenly needs to be paid by the investors when it comes down to renewables, whereas all the infrastructure for all the fossil is being paid by us all. So in that sense there is just a huge discrepancy between how people regard the fossil economy, which we have been doing for decades or centuries, and how we look at the new economy. And I think that's also the importance of such conferences, to broaden our scope ourselves. Then just going to the investors once more, and I think now we are getting a bit closer to the policies. I mean, what we do miss in these kind of discussions, this kind of issue is of course putting central on the agenda the divestment agenda. But divesting is one thing, but then the next question is where to invest in, where to go to. And there, of course, there are a lot of policy decisions being made every day. And for example, just one example on the ETS. Maybe indeed not the most important is even the carbon price, but what do we do with the revenues? What kind of things are we going to change with the revenues? And there the discussion is with the current ministers of finance, who refuse any guidance on what to do with the revenues of ETS or any other policies on the EIB, for example. And I think there we lack the voices of the investors, like pension funds. They are very vocal when it comes down to rules, financial rules, but they are not vocal at all when we are discussing what to do with the revenues, which can give you more certainty if we are in our policy making going into the same direction. So not only divesting, but also steering towards where we do want to invest in. And I think that brings me to the final point, and that is probably, Sanjeev, what you were saying, where the Brits, oh, it was Mark, are naked in the room. The Brits are maybe strong on climate policies, But the current debate is, of course, on the 2030 energy and climate package. That is very actual. The heads of state will reconvene in Brussels on the 20th and the 21st of March. We'll discuss the 2030 climate package. And there what we see now is that maybe we will say something on climate, but we will certainly say not anything on renewables or efficiency, exactly those guidelines that are needed to address the issues we've been discussing today. We not only have to discuss on climate, we do have to discuss also what is the direction we want to go at, what is giving certainty to the investors where to move to, so that you have one concern less. And I think that is the key on why we from the European Parliament have been pushing the issue of going not only for climate target but also for renewables, for efficiency, to very clearly state this is the direction we want to go to. And this is also giving you certainty, Wolfgang, in your business. Surprisingly, the business is lobbying against these kind of certainties. And that is, of course, the biggest problem. In the end, the consistency and really clear direction of policy making on where to go to and how the 2030 economy will look like. And I think that is very clearly linking the discussion we had today on the carbon bubble and policy decisions that needs to be made tomorrow. So in that sense, this was all very informative. But by the 20th and the 21st of March, let's see whether heads of state are by any chance using this information, and unfortunately until now, and there I am unfortunately agreeing with you, Mark, that currently what's at stake, it seems that the heads of state still don't see the real issue what's at stake here. And I think that is maybe not the best conclusion or the most optimistic conclusion. The only thing you could say is, at least in the Parliament on the 22nd until 25th of May, you could at least also determine the colour of the Parliament in which direction it would go. And in that sense, European elections also do matter for that. Thank you very much for all.